Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, a quiet place where curiosity slows its breathing, where science, history and human experience unfold gently enough to follow you into rest. This is a space made for listening more than watching, for letting thoughts drift without needing to land anywhere in particular. Tonight we're setting our course toward a stretch of ocean that has unsettled sailors for centuries, long after maps were filled in and satellites began watching from above. We're going to talk about a place that looks calm in photographs, dramatic in postcards, and deeply unsettling when encountered from the deck of a ship. The Cape of Good Hope. It's a name that sounds reassuring, almost optimistic, like a promise carved into stone by someone who wanted very badly to believe things would turn out well. Good hope, safe passage, a turning point. And yet, if you ask sailors, especially those who have rounded it themselves, the feeling is rarely one of comfort. There's respect there, caution, sometimes quiet fear. Even today, with steel hulls, modern engines, weather forecasts and GPS tracking every movement, the Cape still commands attention in a way few places on Earth do. Before we drift too far into that story, let me ask you something gently. Where are you listening from right now? Are you somewhere close to the sea, where the sound of waves might already be part of your life? Or are you far inland, imagining salt air from a distance? And what time is it where you are? Early evening, the deep hours of night, or perhaps the first quiet moments before dawn? It's always interesting to think that while we talk about a single place on the globe, we're scattered across many moments in the day, each of us listening under a different sky. If you find this kind of slow exploration calming, or if these stories help you unwind after a long stretch of being awake and alert, you're very welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this space reach others who might be looking for the same quiet pause. And now, without rushing, let's begin easing into the story itself. The Cape of Good Hope sits at the southern tip of Africa, where the continent narrows and finally lets go of the land, giving way to open ocean. On a map, it looks like a simple bend in the coastline, nothing especially dramatic at first glance. But maps are tidy things. They flatten what is restless. They turn movement into lines and symbols, and they rarely capture what it feels like to be there. Standing on deck, the Cape is not a line or a point. It is an atmosphere, a sense that something is changing and that not all of it is visible. For centuries, sailors approaching the Cape understood they were leaving one world and entering another. To the east lay the Indian Ocean, warmer, fed by powerful currents that flow down the African coast. To the west lay the Atlantic, colder, heavier, shaped by different winds and a different history of storms. Where these two vast systems meet, they do not blend politely, they collide. And that collision is one of the reasons the Cape has earned its reputation. Water there behaves differently. Waves don't always line up neatly. Swells can come from opposing directions, stacking unpredictably, lifting ships unevenly, stressing hulls and nerves alike. A vessel might ride smoothly for hours and then, without much warning, find itself thrown into confused seas where no single rhythm dominates. Even experienced sailors talk about the discomfort of it, the feeling that the ocean beneath them can't quite make up its mind. The winds are no more cooperative. The Cape lies within the path of powerful weather systems that circle the southern hemisphere. These winds have a reputation for arriving suddenly and with force, sometimes building far more quickly than forecasts suggest. Sailors have long described them as winds that do not negotiate. They arrive, they take control, and they leave only when they are finished. In the age of sail, this meant shredded canvas, snapped masts, and long hours of fighting, simply to stay pointed in a survivable direction. But fear of the Cape has never been just about wind and water. There is also history, and history has a way of lingering. The Cape became infamous during the age of exploration, when European ships began pushing farther from familiar coastlines, driven by trade, ambition, and the belief that the world could be navigated if one were persistent enough. Many of those ships never made it past this point. Some were lost to storms, others struck hidden rocks, others simply vanished, leaving behind only speculation and the uneasy knowledge that the sea had kept its secrets. Early sailors didn't always call it the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias originally named it the Cape of Storms, a far more honest description from the perspective of those who encountered it firsthand. The name was later changed, not because the storms disappeared, but because optimism was necessary. The Cape represented a gateway to new trade routes, to wealth, to connection between Europe and Asia. Calling it hopeful was as much a psychological strategy as a geographical one. Still, hope does not calm the ocean, and even as navigation improved, even as charts became more accurate and ships more robust, the Cape maintained its ability to unsettle. Sailors learned to approach it carefully, to wait for favourable conditions when possible, and to never underestimate how quickly those conditions could change. There are countless logs and journals that speak not in dramatic language, but in measured tones that nonetheless reveal tension. Mentions of shortened sails, extra watches posted, sleep taken lightly, if at all. What makes the Cape particularly unnerving is that danger there doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes the sky remains deceptively clear, the horizon looks manageable, and then the sea begins to change beneath the hull, a shift in current, a subtle but growing cross-swell, the kind of movement that doesn't immediately feel catastrophic but slowly erodes stability. It's the kind of danger that demands attention, not because it is spectacular, but because it is persistent. Modern sailors, even those commanding large commercial vessels, still speak of rounding the Cape with caution. Engines may replace sails, but physics remains stubbornly unchanged. A powerful current flowing south meets another moving north. Wind pushes against water already in motion. Waves reflect off the coastline and return at odd angles. The result is a sea state that can challenge even the most advanced designs. Container ships have lost cargo there. Smaller vessels have capsized. Fishing boats have been overwhelmed within sight of land. There is also the psychological weight of knowing where you are. Sailors are acutely aware of latitude, of distance from safe harbour, of the fact that beyond the Cape lies a long stretch of open ocean with few places to retreat. This awareness sharpens every sensation. Every creak of the ship is noted. Every change in pitch or roll is felt more deeply. Fatigue accumulates differently when there is no easy escape. And then there is night. Darkness at sea is always a particular experience, but near the Cape it carries extra tension. The absence of visible land does not mean the absence of danger. Swells still arrive. Winds still rise. Navigation lights become small islands of certainty in an otherwise shifting world. Many sailors describe the feeling of being watched, not in a supernatural sense, but in the way one feels observed by something vast and indifferent. The ocean does not threaten. It simply exists, and that can be far more unsettling. What's important to understand is that fear here is not panic. It is respect. Sailors who fear the Cape do not fear it because it is unknowable. They fear it because it is very well known. Its patterns have been studied, its dangers documented, and yet it retains the ability to surprise. That combination is what keeps it alive in maritime culture, as a place that deserves careful attention. As we continue, we'll start to look more closely at what actually happens when oceans meet, how wind systems shape the Cape's reputation, and why stories from centuries ago still influence how modern sailors think about this stretch of water. We'll move gradually, staying with the human experience as much as the physical forces at play, because the fear surrounding the Cape has always been as much about perception and memory as it has been about waves and weather. For now, just let the image settle. A ship moving steadily south, the water darkening, the wind shifting, a coastline that offers no easy reassurance, the Cape waiting as it always has, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a reminder that some places ask to be taken seriously no matter how much time passes. Long before satellites traced weather systems from orbit, and before charts reduced coastlines to neat curves and coordinates, sailors understood the world in terms of edges. Not edges in the sense of cliffs or borders drawn with ink, but edges as places where familiar patterns stopped behaving as expected. The Cape of Good Hope has always been one of those places. It is not merely a point of land at the bottom of Africa. It is a boundary between behaviours, between moods of the sea, between systems that were never meant to cooperate politely. To sail toward it is to feel that something gradual but irreversible is happening, even when nothing dramatic appears to be unfolding yet. Approaching from the Atlantic side, the water carries a particular weight. It is colder, darker, and often more deliberate in its motion. The Atlantic has spent thousands of kilometres gathering itself, shaped by winds that have crossed open expanses with very little interruption. By the time those swells reach the southern tip of Africa, they are mature, well-formed, and persistent. They do not rise and fall quickly. They roll with confidence, lifting ships slowly and setting them down again, with the kind of patience that can wear on both hull and mind. From the other direction comes the Indian Ocean, warmer and faster, driven southward along the African coast by a powerful current that rarely rests. This water feels different even before instruments confirm it. Sailors talk about the temperature change, the way fog behaves differently, the way the surface seems more restless even on calmer days. The Indian Ocean carries energy north to south, momentum that does not dissipate easily. It arrives at the Cape already in motion, already intent on continuing. Where these two systems meet, there is no clean dividing line. There is no moment where one ends and the other begins. Instead, there is overlap, interference. The Atlantic pushes eastward, while the Indian Ocean pushes south and west. Swells cross at angles that are uncomfortable rather than immediately dangerous, but discomfort at sea is rarely something to ignore. A ship designed to move efficiently through waves coming from one direction suddenly finds itself being lifted from below and struck from the side at the same time. This crossing of forces is one of the first things sailors notice, even if they cannot immediately explain it in technical terms. The motion becomes uneven. The deck tilts unpredictably. Items that were stable an hour earlier begin to slide or sway. Sleep becomes lighter. Conversations shorten. No one announces that they have reached the edge of two worlds, but everyone feels it. Wind adds another layer to this complexity. The southern oceans are famous for their wind belts, powerful currents of air that circle the globe with little to slow them down. These winds arrive at the Cape with momentum built over vast distances, shaped by temperature differences and the rotation of the Earth itself. They do not arrive gently. They arrive as systems, sometimes stacking upon one another, sometimes shifting direction faster than crews would prefer. What makes this especially challenging is that the winds do not always align with the waves beneath them. A strong wind blowing against a current can cause waves to steepen rapidly, growing taller without growing longer. These waves are shorter, sharper, and more likely to break. For a ship, this means impacts that feel sudden and forceful, rather than rhythmic. The hull meets resistance more abruptly. Spray flies higher. The sense of control narrows. Sailors have long known that the most dangerous seas are not always the tallest ones. A single, massive swell can often be anticipated and ridden with preparation. But confused seas, where energy arrives from multiple directions at once, deny that preparation. They require constant adjustment. Helmsmen work continuously. Engines strain. Sails, when used, must be managed carefully, shortened or repositioned again and again. This is where the idea of the Cape as a psychological boundary becomes important. It is not just a place where conditions are difficult. It is a place where certainty erodes. Instruments may still function perfectly. Charts may still be accurate. But the environment refuses to settle into patterns that feel reliable, and humans, especially those responsible for ships and lives, crave reliability. Historically, this uncertainty was magnified by limited information. Early sailors did not know what waited beyond the horizon. They relied on experience passed down through stories, often exaggerated but rooted in real danger. Tales of ships disappearing were not just superstition, they were records of losses that could not be fully explained with the knowledge available at the time. A vessel would round the Cape and simply fail to arrive at its destination. No wreckage, no survivors, only absence. Even today, with data flowing constantly to and from vessels, the Cape retains an echo of that uncertainty. Weather forecasts provide guidance, but they cannot account for every interaction between current, wind, and seafloor. Beneath the surface, the ocean floor rises and falls in ways that influence wave behaviour. Currents accelerate over shallower areas. Waves refract, change direction, and sometimes grow unexpectedly as energy is compressed. Sailors rounding the Cape often describe a heightened awareness of time. Not the ticking of clocks, but the sense that conditions must be read continuously. A window of relative calm might open briefly, inviting passage, only to close again with a little warning. Decisions are made carefully. To wait too long is to risk being caught in worsening weather. To move too quickly is to risk encountering conditions unprepared. There is also the simple reality of scale. At the edge of two oceans, the sense of exposure increases. Land feels less protective. Even when the coastline is visible, it offers limited shelter. The shapes of bays and cliffs do not break the force of the sea in the way sailors might hope. In some cases, proximity to land increases danger, introducing rocks and unpredictable wave reflections into an already complicated situation. This is why sailors speak of the Cape with a particular tone, not fear in the theatrical sense, but an acknowledgement that this is not a place to be casual. Routines are tightened, checks are repeated, fatigue is monitored more closely. The crew knows that small mistakes can compound quickly when conditions refuse to cooperate. What is interesting is how consistent these descriptions remain across centuries. A logbook from the 17th century reads differently from a modern report, but the underlying experience is recognisable. Uneven seas, shifting winds, the feeling that the ocean is asserting itself rather than merely responding. Technology has changed, but the meeting of two worlds has not. As ships pass this boundary, something subtle happens to the people aboard. The journey takes on a different character. The Atlantic behind them is no longer relevant. The Indian Ocean ahead carries its own expectations. The Cape marks a transition not just in geography, but in mindset. It is a point where sailors recalibrate, adjusting their understanding of what lies ahead. This recalibration is part of what makes the Cape linger in memory. It is not a dramatic climax that resolves quickly. It is a drawn-out crossing, an extended moment of heightened awareness that slowly fades only after distance has been gained. Long after the land has slipped below the horizon, sailors still feel as though they are under the influence of that meeting place, and this influence is not limited to those at sea. The stories told on land, in ports and homes reinforce the idea that the Cape is something different, a place where oceans argue, where confidence must be balanced with caution, where experience matters but humility matters more. As we move forward, it becomes clearer that the fear associated with the Cape does not come from a single storm or a single tragedy. It comes from accumulation, from countless crossings where conditions resisted expectation, from generations of sailors who learned, sometimes painfully, that this edge does not forgive complacency. The edge of two worlds is not marked by signs or coordinates alone. It is felt in the body, in the way balance becomes harder to maintain, in the way attention sharpens. It is a reminder that the planet is not a collection of static places, but a system in constant motion, with boundaries defined by behaviour rather than lines on a map. And as ships continue their passage, leaving this boundary behind them, the Cape does not release its grip all at once. It loosens slowly, allowing the rhythm of a new ocean to take hold, preparing sailors for what comes next, while leaving behind the quiet understanding that they have crossed something real, even if it cannot be seen. Names have power, especially the ones given to places where people have struggled, survived, or failed. The name Cape of Good Hope sounds reassuring, almost gentle, as though it were chosen to comfort those approaching it. It suggests optimism, relief, a sense that the worst is behind you and something better lies ahead. But the truth is far less comforting, and sailors have always known it. This coastline was never named for how it behaves. It was named for what people wanted it to mean. When early European sailors first pushed south along the African coast, they were not chasing beauty or adventure for its own sake. They were chasing roots, spices, wealth, and the possibility of reaching Asia without crossing hostile land empires. Every mile southward was a gamble, and the farther they went, the less familiar the world became. Storms intensified, winds shifted, currents pulled in unexpected directions. By the time ships reached the southern tip of Africa, crews were exhausted, ships were worn, and confidence was already under strain. Bartolomeu Dias, the Portuguese navigator often credited with being the first European to round the Cape in 1488, did not experience it as a hopeful place. His ships were battered by violent storms, blown far off course, and pushed southward beyond sight of land. When he eventually turned north and realised he had passed the southern end of the continent, the relief was mixed with fear. The journey had been brutal. The coastline he later identified was jagged, exposed and hostile. He reportedly called it the Cape of Storms, a name that reflected experience rather than aspiration. The renaming came later, driven by politics and psychology as much as geography. Portugal's king at the time, John II, understood that the success of future voyages depended not just on ships and sailors, but on belief. A route defined by storms was not one that inspired investment or courage. A route defined by hope, however fragile, was easier to sell. The name Cape of Good Hope reframed the narrative. It suggested that while danger existed, reward awaited those who endured it. This distinction matters because it shaped how generations of sailors approached the Cape. They did not expect safety, they expected possibility. The Cape was not a refuge, but a threshold. Rounding it meant that the long, punishing descent down the African coast was complete. Ahead lay new seas, new winds, and eventually, if fortune allowed, new ports. The hope was not that the Cape would be kind, but that it would be passable. Standing before the Cape, either from the deck of a ship or from the cliffs above, that naming feels almost ironic. The coastline offers little in the way of shelter. Sheer rock faces drop into heavy surf. Waves strike with a force that feels deliberate, even when the weather appears calm. There are few natural harbours, and those that exist are often exposed to swells wrapping around the headland. For a sailor in trouble, the land is not an automatic escape. In some cases, it is an added hazard. This is one of the reasons the Cape developed such a complex reputation. On one hand, it represented progress. On the other, it represented vulnerability. Ships approaching it were often at their most worn. Hulls had endured months of constant motion. Rigging was strained. Supplies were running low. Crews were tired, sometimes sick. The Cape did not meet them with reassurance. It met them with one final test before granting passage into a different world. The danger here has always been cumulative rather than singular. There is no single feature you can point to and say, that is why ships are lost. It is the combination of factors, each manageable on its own, that becomes overwhelming together. Strong currents pull vessels closer to shore than intended. Winds shift faster than sails can be adjusted. Waves reflect off the coastline and return at odd angles, creating chaotic motion near land. Rocks wait just below the surface, invisible until it is too late. Even experienced sailors have made fatal misjudgments here, often not because they lack skill, but because the margin for error is thin. A small miscalculation in speed or heading can place a ship in a position where recovery is difficult. Once momentum works against you, options narrow quickly. In the age of sail, this could mean being driven onto rocks. In the modern era, it can still mean engine failure under strain or cargo shifting in heavy seas. And yet, ships keep coming. They always have. Trade routes still pass nearby. Fishing vessels still work these waters. Research ships, cruise liners, and private yachts still round the Cape. Each does so with an understanding inherited from centuries of experience. The name may promise hope, but the approach is grounded in caution. There is something deeply human about this contrast. We name things not as they are, but as we wish them to be. The Cape of Good Hope reflects that instinct perfectly. It is a reminder that optimism often serves as a tool for endurance. Sailors facing months of hardship needed something to look forward to. A name suggesting hope provided just enough psychological support to push onward. This psychological element should not be underestimated. Fear at sea is rarely loud. It is quiet, persistent, and draining. The belief that a milestone marks progress can keep exhaustion from turning into despair. Even if the milestone itself is dangerous, its symbolic value matters. Rounding the Cape meant that a significant portion of the journey was complete. It meant that turning back was no longer the only sensible option. But symbolism does not calm waves, and sailors have always understood the difference between hope and safety. This understanding is embedded in maritime culture. Songs, superstitions, and rituals often surround dangerous passages. Some sailors refuse to whistle near the Cape, believing it angers the wind. Others insist on specific routines, not because they change the ocean, but because they provide a sense of control. Modern sailors may smile at these traditions, but many still observe them in quiet ways. Extra checks are performed. Watches are extended. Rest is prioritized when possible. No one assumes that a well-built ship guarantees an easy passage. The Cape has outlived that illusion many times over. The coastline itself seems to reinforce this lesson. It does not soften with familiarity. Weathered cliffs show the marks of constant erosion, shaped by forces that have no memory and no intention. The sea there is not dramatic for effect. It behaves as it must according to currents, winds, and gravity. Ships that pass safely do so not because the Cape allows it, but because conditions align briefly enough to permit it. This is why stories about the Cape often feel understated. Sailors do not describe it with exaggerated language. They speak of it plainly, listing conditions, timings, and decisions. Beneath that practicality lies respect, the kind of respect reserved for something that does not negotiate and does not apologize. Over time, the name Cape of Good Hope has taken on a layered meaning. It is hopeful not because it offers protection, but because it represents persistence. It stands as proof that humans can move through dangerous places without conquering them, only navigating them carefully. The hope lies in passage, not in comfort. As ships clear the Cape and adjust course toward new waters, there is often a subtle release of tension. Not celebration exactly, but a loosening. The crew knows they are not immune to future challenges, but one particular test is behind them. The name lingers in their thoughts, not as a promise kept, but as a reminder of what it took to move forward. And this idea, that hope and safety are not the same thing, carries beyond the sea. The Cape's name reflects a broader truth about how humans face uncertainty. We move toward what frightens us not because it is safe, but because something on the other side matters enough to try. As the coastline recedes and the ship settles into the rhythm of a new ocean, the Cape remains behind, unchanged, continuing to test the next vessel that approaches. Its name endures, not because it misleads, but because it reveals something honest about those who named it. Hope was never meant to describe the place itself. It was meant to describe the people willing to face it. For most of human history, the sea was not something you crossed with confidence. It was something you negotiated with caution, intuition, and a collection of tools that were only sometimes trustworthy. Long before satellites corrected positions within meters and digital charts updated themselves automatically, Sailors relied on maps that were incomplete at best and misleading at worst. Nowhere did this uncertainty feel more unsettling than near the southern tip of Africa, where the world itself seemed to refuse clear explanation. Early nautical maps were works of interpretation rather than precision. Coastlines were sketched from memory, rumour, and partial observation. Distances were estimated. Shapes were exaggerated or compressed depending on who had last described them. In many cases, areas that had never been visited were filled in with educated guesses, decorative flourishes, or blank space that quietly admitted ignorance. To sail with such a map was to carry not certainty but suggestion. As ships pushed farther south along Africa's western coast, those suggestions began to unravel. The land did not always appear where the map implied it would. Headlands seemed farther apart or closer together than expected. Bays that looked promising on parchment turned out to be exposed or shallow. The comforting illusion that someone else had already understood this place dissolved mile by mile. Compasses, too, were less reliable than modern sailors might imagine. While they pointed north, they didn't always point to the same north. Magnetic variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north, was poorly understood for centuries. Near the Cape, this variation could be significant, causing compasses to drift just enough to matter over long distances. A few degrees off course might not seem like much on land, but at sea it could place a ship dangerously close to shore or far off its intended track. Sailors noticed this hesitation, even if they could not explain it scientifically. They recorded strange behaviour in their logs. Compasses that seemed steady one day would feel unreliable the next. Bearings that should have led safely past the coast instead drew ships toward unseen hazards. This inconsistency bred doubt, and doubt at sea is exhausting. When instruments cannot be trusted, every decision demands more effort. This uncertainty was compounded by the lack of reliable longitude measurement. Latitude could be estimated by the height of the sun or stars, but longitude remained elusive until much later. Sailors knew how far north or south they were, but east and west position was largely guesswork, calculated by speed, direction, and time, all of which were themselves subject to error. Near the Cape, where currents could quietly alter speed and direction, these calculations became even less dependable. Imagine standing on deck after weeks or months at sea, approaching a coastline that you believe should be there, but cannot yet see. The map suggests land is close. The compass offers a heading that feels uncertain. The wind and current whisper different stories. Every sense is engaged and none offer complete reassurance. This was the reality for countless crews rounding the Cape for the first time. Maps also failed to capture the behaviour of the sea itself. They showed coastlines, not currents. They marked landmarks, not wave patterns. The powerful flow of warm water moving south along Africa's eastern side and the colder Atlantic current pressing northward along the western side were invisible to ink and parchment. Sailors learned about them only by experiencing their effects. A ship might be carried faster than expected, or slowed inexplicably. Headings that worked yesterday no longer work today. This mismatch between expectation and experience created stories. Sailors spoke of invisible hands pulling ships off course, of waters that resisted progress, of places where the sea behaved as though it had intentions. These descriptions were not superstition in the modern sense. They were attempts to articulate forces that could not yet be named. Compasses hesitated not because they were faulty, but because the Earth itself is complex. Magnetic fields are not uniform. They shift over time. Near certain regions, they behave in ways that early navigators had no framework to understand. The Cape sits within a zone where these effects were noticeable enough to cause real problems, especially when combined with fatigue and stress. When a ship's course did not align with the map, blame often fell on the crew. Captains were accused of poor judgment, pilots were questioned, arguments broke out over readings and estimates. But increasingly, sailors began to accept that the tools themselves had limits. This acceptance did not remove fear, but it shifted it. The ocean was no longer just dangerous because of storms or rocks. It was dangerous because it defied easy measurement. This realization marked an important psychological shift. The sea could not be fully mastered with lines and symbols. Knowledge would have to be experiential, built through repetition, shared stories, and caution. Sailing instructions began to include advice that went beyond coordinates. They spoke of seasons, prevailing winds, and signs to watch for in the water and sky. The Cape, in particular, earned long descriptions filled with warnings and qualifications. Even as maps improved, the reputation lingered. By the time more accurate charts were produced, the Cape was already embedded in maritime culture as a place where confidence must be tempered. Better information did not erase that identity. If anything, it reinforced it. More data confirmed what sailors already suspected. This was not a place where navigation could be treated casually. There was also the issue of scale. Early maps often distorted proportions. The southern tip of Africa was sometimes drawn smaller or simpler than reality suggested. In practice, rounding it involved navigating a broad, exposed area with shifting conditions across many miles. The sense of being funneled through a narrow passage was misleading. The danger was spread out, subtle, and persistent rather than concentrated in one dramatic moment. Sailors who survived early crossings carried these lessons forward. They taught apprentices to distrust certainty near the Cape, to double-check readings, to watch the sea more than the page, to listen to the ship itself, the way it moved and responded. Navigation became as much about interpretation as calculation. Modern technology has closed many of these gaps, but not all. Electronic charts are precise, but they still rely on models. Compasses are corrected automatically, but they still respond to a magnetic field that is not static. GPS systems are remarkably accurate, yet sailors are trained to consider what happens when they fail. Near the Cape, redundancy is not optional, it is routine. What remains from the era of unreliable maps and hesitant compasses is not ignorance, but humility. The understanding that representation is not reality, that no matter how well a place is documented, it retains the ability to surprise. The Cape taught sailors this lesson early and repeatedly. As ships today approach the same coastline, they do so with far better tools, yet many of the same instincts. They watch for discrepancies, they compare readings, they remain alert to the possibility that something does not quite match expectation. The sea has not changed its behaviour simply because humans have improved their measurements. In this way, the Cape stands as a reminder of a time when the world was larger, not in size, but in uncertainty. When knowledge was fragile and progress required trust in imperfect tools. That uncertainty left its mark not only on maps, but on the mindset of those who ventured beyond familiar waters. As navigation slowly became more reliable, the fear associated with the Cape did not vanish. It evolved. It became less about the unknown location of land, and more about the known behaviour of forces that could not be fully controlled. The Cape did not become safer simply because it became better mapped. It became better understood, and understanding in this case reinforced caution rather than eliminating it. Moving forward, we begin to see how these early navigational struggles shaped the way sailors interpreted the Cape itself, not just as a physical place, but as a lesson written into the history of exploration, a place where confidence in tools had to give way to awareness of limits, setting the stage for an enduring respect that continues long after maps stopped lying and compasses learned to speak more clearly. There are places in the world where the sea feels unified, where its movements follow a pattern that can be learned, anticipated, and slowly trusted. Sailors come to recognize the rhythm of those waters, the way waves rise and fall, the way wind and current usually agree on a direction. The Cape of Good Hope is not one of those places. Here, the sea feels divided, as though two vast bodies are occupying the same space without acknowledging one another, each insisting on its own momentum. This is the meeting place of unfriendly seas, not because either ocean is malicious, but because they are fundamentally different and unwilling to compromise. On one side lies the Atlantic Ocean, cold, heavy and deliberate, shaped by long fetches of wind that have crossed thousands of kilometres of open water. On the other lies the Indian Ocean, warmer and faster, driven by a powerful current that moves south along the African coast with remarkable persistence. When these two systems converge, the result is not balance, but tension. The Atlantic arrives with long-period swells, waves that have been travelling for days or weeks, carrying energy gathered far from land. These swells are deep and confident, lifting ships slowly but with undeniable force. They tend to move in organised lines, giving sailors time to adjust, to anticipate the rise and fall. In isolation, these waves are manageable, even familiar to those who have crossed the ocean before. The Indian Ocean contributes something entirely different. Its defining feature near the Cape is the Agulhas Current, one of the strongest ocean currents in the world. This river of warm water flows swiftly southward along the eastern edge of Africa, hugging the coastline before bending back into the Indian Ocean. It carries enormous energy, not always visible on the surface, but always present beneath it. When strong winds blow against this current, especially winds coming from the southwest, the sea transforms quickly. Waves steepen, growing taller without spreading out. The distance between crests shortens. Instead of rolling, waves begin to pitch forward, breaking violently. These are not waves that gently lift a vessel and let it pass. They strike repeatedly with little warning. Now add the Atlantic swell into this equation. Waves arrive from one direction, current pushes from another, and wind asserts itself from a third. The surface becomes chaotic. Sailors refer to this as confused seas, a term that sounds mild until you experience it. Confusion here means that the ocean no longer offers a predictable pattern. The ship is lifted unevenly. One moment the bow rises sharply, the next the stern drops. Side-to-side motion combines with pitching, placing constant strain on hull and crew. This kind of sea state is exhausting, not just physically, but mentally. There is no rhythm to settle into. Every few seconds demand adjustment. Muscles remain tense. Balance is never quite regained. Sleep becomes fragmented. Even seasoned sailors find themselves worn down faster than they expect. The danger of unfriendly seas is not always obvious to those unfamiliar with them. From a distance, the ocean may not appear extreme. There may be no towering waves, no dramatic walls of water. Instead, the threat lies in the inconsistency. Short, steep waves hit at awkward angles. Spray reduces visibility. The ship slams rather than glides, each impact sending vibrations through the structure. Over time, this pounding takes a toll. Mechanical components are stressed. Cargo can shift. Small weaknesses become significant problems. A hatch that might have held in calmer seas begins to leak. Equipment secured under normal conditions works loose. What might have been a minor inconvenience elsewhere becomes serious when the sea refuses to ease. Historically, this meeting of seas caught sailors off guard again and again. Early navigators expected storms to be the primary threat. They prepared for wind and rain, for darkness and lightning. What they were less prepared for was the sea itself turning against them without the drama of a visible storm. Ships could be overwhelmed in conditions that did not appear catastrophic from a distance. Many shipwrecks near the Cape occurred not during legendary tempests, but during periods of sustained rough seas. Vessels struggled to make headway against opposing forces. Fatigue set in, navigation errors multiplied. Eventually, proximity to land, once seen as salvation, became another hazard as waves pushed ships closer to rocks they could not escape. The coastline near the Cape reflects this history. Beneath the water lie countless remnants of vessels that underestimated the complexity of the sea there. Their stories are not all dramatic. Some involve slow deterioration rather than sudden disaster. A ship driven off course just enough to lose safe water. A hull weakened over days of pounding before failing at the wrong moment. Modern science explains much of this behaviour now. Oceanographers understand how currents interact with wind to shape wave height and steepness. They can model how energy transfers between systems. But explanation does not eliminate impact. A ship still feels every collision with the sea, regardless of whether the crew understands the equations behind it. This is why sailors continue to speak of the Cape with caution. They know that unfriendly seas do not announce themselves clearly. A forecast might indicate manageable conditions, yet the interaction of current and swell can create localized dangers that models smooth over. Experience teaches sailors to look beyond numbers, to read the water directly. The sea here also changes quickly. A favourable condition can degrade within hours. Wind direction shifts slightly, and suddenly waves begin to build in a way that feels wrong. Crews monitor these changes closely. Decisions are revisited, routes are adjusted. Sometimes the safest choice is to slow down, to wait, to accept delay rather than force progress. For those on board, the meeting of unfriendly seas creates a particular kind of awareness. The ocean is no longer background. It demands attention. Every sound is interpreted. Every movement is assessed. Even those who have crossed many oceans sense the difference here. There is a feeling of being tested, not aggressively, but persistently. This persistence is what gives the Cape its enduring reputation. A single dramatic storm would be easier to remember, easier to frame as an exception. But the Cape offers something more subtle and more challenging. It presents difficulty as a constant possibility rather than a single event. Sailors must remain vigilant not for minutes, but for days. The unfriendly nature of these seas has influenced shipping routes and practices for centuries. Captains plan passages carefully, considering season, vessel type, and crew condition. Smaller vessels often wait for extended periods, watching weather patterns, knowing that impatience can be costly. Larger ships rely on power and mass, but even they respect the limits imposed by wave geometry and force. Fishing vessels working these waters face especially high risk. They operate closer to shore, where currents accelerate and waves reflect. Their smaller size makes them more vulnerable to sudden changes. Many local sailors have personal stories of narrow escapes, of moments when the sea reminded them how quickly it can shift from workable to overwhelming. Despite all this, the sea does not feel hostile in a human sense. It feels indifferent. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans are not arguing. They are simply obeying physical laws, each carrying energy shaped by geography and climate. Their meeting is inevitable, and the result is what it must be. Understanding this indifference is part of what allows sailors to cope with it. Fear rooted in mystery can paralyze. Fear rooted in knowledge can sharpen. At the Cape, sailors learn to respect the meeting of unfriendly seas not as a curse, but as a reality that demands adaptation. As vessels push through this convergence and gradually move away from the Cape, the sea often begins to settle. Patterns re-emerge. Motion becomes more predictable. The body relaxes slightly. The unfriendly meeting loosens its grip, replaced by the personality of a single ocean once more. But the memory remains. Sailors carry it forward, sharing it with others, embedding it in training and tradition. The Cape's seas teach a lesson that does not fade easily, that even in a world mapped and measured, there are places where forces overlap in ways that resist simplification. And as we continue, it becomes clear that these unfriendly seas are only part of the story. Above them, the air behaves with equal complexity, shaping conditions in ways that compound the challenge. The meeting does not stop at the water's surface. It rises into the sky, carried by winds that follow their own rules, adding yet another layer to why this place continues to command respect long after its dangers were first named. There are winds that announce themselves politely. They arrive gradually, building over hours, giving sailors time to reef sails, adjust course, and prepare both ship and mind for what is coming. And then there are winds like those that haunt the waters around the Cape of Good Hope. These winds do not negotiate. They do not wait. They arrive because conditions allow them to arrive, and once present, They behave as though permission was never part of the arrangement. The Cape sits in a part of the world where atmospheric systems have a long, uninterrupted run. To the south lies the Southern Ocean, a vast ring of water encircling Antarctica with almost no land to slow the movement of air. Winds there can travel thousands of kilometers without obstruction, gathering strength, consistency, and confidence. By the time they curve northward toward the Cape, they are fully developed, shaped by planetary rotation and temperature gradients that have been working on them for days. These winds are not random gusts, they are organized systems, often associated with powerful cold fronts that sweep eastward around the globe. When one of these systems approaches the Cape, the change can be felt long before the full force arrives. The air becomes sharper, barometric pressure begins to fall. The sea surface subtly shifts, waves tightening their spacing as energy transfers from air to water. What unsettles sailors most is how quickly this process can accelerate. A steady breeze becomes a strong wind. A strong wind becomes a gale. The transition does not always come with dramatic warning signs. Clouds may thicken, but the sky does not necessarily darken immediately. Rain may lag behind wind by hours. The first indication might simply be the sound, a deeper, more continuous roar as air begins to press harder against rigging and superstructure. Historically, this rapid escalation caught countless crews off guard. In the age of sail, response time mattered. Sails had to be shortened, sometimes hauled in by exhausted hands fighting both wind and motion. Masts and spars were under constant stress, and the margin between carrying enough sail to maintain control and carrying too much was narrow. Too little sail, and a ship could lose maneuverability, turning broadside to the waves. Too much, and something would eventually give. These winds often arrive from the southwest, directly opposing the powerful current flowing south along the coast. This opposition is where danger multiplies. Wind pushing against current forces, water upward, steepening waves dramatically. What might have been a manageable sea under lighter wind becomes a field of breaking crests, each one striking with force disproportionate to its size. The ship does not rise smoothly. It is stopped, jolted, and thrown. Even modern vessels with engines capable of pushing against strong headwinds feel the strain here. Fuel consumption rises sharply, engines labour. Progress slows to a crawl or stops entirely. Crews monitor systems closely, knowing that prolonged stress increases the risk of mechanical failure. A malfunction that might be inconvenient elsewhere can become critical when wind and sea refuse to allow safe repairs. Another unsettling quality of Cape winds is their persistence. They do not always blow violently for a short period and then move on. Often, they maintain strength over many hours or days. This endurance wears down both equipment and people. Fatigue accumulates. Small mistakes become more likely. Decision-making slows. The wind does not exploit these weaknesses intentionally, but it does not accommodate them either. Sailors describe a particular sound associated with these winds, a constant pressure rather than sharp gusts. It fills the air, rattling fittings, humming through rigging, vibrating metal and wood alike. Over time, it becomes difficult to escape mentally. Even below deck, the noise intrudes, making rest shallow and fragmented. Sleep comes in brief stretches, interrupted by the sense that vigilance is required at all times. There is also the matter of direction. Near the Cape, winds are notorious for shifting unexpectedly as fronts pass and systems interact. A favourable wind can veer rapidly, forcing quick adjustments. In older vessels, this meant repositioning sails under worsening conditions. In modern ships, it still requires careful handling to prevent dangerous angles to the sea. These shifts are not always dramatic, but they are often poorly timed. A change in wind direction can arrive just as waves build, creating a combination that places the ship in an awkward orientation. The bow no longer meets waves head-on. The vessel begins to roll and pitch simultaneously. Crew members move cautiously, bracing themselves against surfaces that no longer provide reliable support. For those unfamiliar with the region, the Cape's winds can feel almost personal, as though the environment itself resists passage. But seasoned sailors understand that this resistance is structural, not intentional. The Cape lies at a crossroads of global circulation patterns. Warm air from lower latitudes meets colder air sweeping up from the south. The resulting pressure differences drive movement, and the Earth's rotation bends that movement into powerful sweeping flows. What makes this particularly challenging is that these systems are not confined neatly to predictable paths. They interact with the coastline, with the ocean's surface, with each other. Forecasts provide guidance, but local effects can amplify or dampen expected conditions. A ship might skirt the edge of a system and experience manageable winds, while another vessel a short distance away encounters something far harsher. In the past, sailors relied on observation rather than prediction. They watched cloud formations, noting the shape and speed of movement. They felt changes in temperature and humidity. They listened to the wind's tone, learning to distinguish between steady strength and building force. These skills were passed down through apprenticeship, refined through experience, and often learned the hard way. Today, meteorological data has transformed planning, but it has not removed uncertainty. Captains still study pressure charts carefully when approaching the Cape. They weigh the risks of delaying against the risks of proceeding. Time schedules become flexible. Safety margins widen. There is an understanding that the wind here does not reward stubbornness. The psychological impact of these winds should not be underestimated. Humans are adaptable, but constant pressure erodes resilience. The feeling of being pushed, resisted, and slowed by an invisible force creates tension that accumulates quietly. Even confident crews grow quieter, conversations shorten, attention narrows to essentials. The wind becomes the dominant presence shaping every action. This atmosphere has influenced maritime culture for centuries. Songs, sayings, and traditions reflect a respect for southern winds. Sailors speak of them as something to be endured rather than conquered. There is an acceptance that control is limited, that success lies in timing and restraint rather than force. The Cape's winds have also shaped ship design. Vessels intended to operate in southern waters are built stronger, with reinforced hulls and systems designed to handle sustained stress. Rigging configurations evolved to allow quicker reduction of sail. Engines and stabilizers are designed with heavy weather in mind. These adaptations are acknowledgements, not solutions. They reduce risk, but they do not remove it. Local sailors, those who know these waters intimately, often speak of the wind with familiarity rather than fear. They recognize patterns, they anticipate seasonal behavior. Yet even they remain cautious. Experience teaches respect, not complacency. Every crossing is treated as its own event, not as a repetition of the last. What stands out in all of this is how little the wind cares about human schedules. Cargo deadlines, personal plans, even survival itself are irrelevant to atmospheric dynamics. The wind blows because the physics of the planet demand it. The Cape happens to sit where those demands are expressed with unusual intensity. As ships endure these winds and gradually find moments of relative shelter or shifting conditions, there is often a sense of partial relief rather than victory. The wind may ease, but memory lingers. The body remains tense for hours afterward, as though expecting the pressure to return. Sailors do not celebrate calm too quickly. They have learned that it can be temporary, and as the wind continues its long journey eastward, circling the globe toward other shores, the Cape remains behind, waiting for the next system, the next convergence, the next moment when air and sea align in a way that tests those who pass through. The winds do not ask permission, and they do not announce departure either. They simply move on, leaving behind ships that must recalibrate, recover, and prepare for whatever follows. Because beyond the wind itself lies another challenge, one that works quietly beneath the surface, pulling and redirecting with patience rather than force. Currents that remember where they have been, that carry energy long after the wind that shaped them has moved on, continuing the Cape's lesson that not all dangers arrive with noise, and not all resistance is visible at first glance. Some forces at sea announce themselves loudly. Wind roars, waves crash, rain hammers metal and deck. Currents are different. They do their work quietly, beneath the surface, out of sight, and often out of mind until their influence becomes impossible to ignore. Around the Cape of Good Hope, currents behave with a persistence that feels almost intentional, not because they are aware, but because they remember where they have come from and continue moving as though stopping were never an option. The most influential of these currents is the Agulhas current, a powerful flow of warm water that runs southward along the eastern coast of Africa. It begins far to the north, fed by the immense circulation of the Indian Ocean, gathering strength over thousands of kilometres. By the time it reaches the latitude of the Cape, it is narrow, fast, and deeply energetic. Sailors sometimes describe it as an underwater river, not because it looks like one, but because it behaves like one, carrying momentum that does not dissipate easily. This current does not end neatly at the Cape. Instead, it bends, sheds large, looping eddies, and interacts with colder Atlantic waters in complex ways. Some of its energy turns back toward the Indian Ocean. Some of it leaks into the South Atlantic. The boundary between these systems is not fixed. It shifts day by day, sometimes hour by hour, influenced by wind, temperature, and the shape of the sea floor. For a ship, this creates a subtle but constant challenge. A vessel may be pointed in one direction, engines working steadily, sails trimmed carefully, yet still be carried sideways or forward faster than expected. The difference might be small at first, barely noticeable over minutes. Over hours, it compounds. Bearings drift. Estimated positions become less reliable. Navigation demands correction after correction. What makes these currents especially unsettling is that they often work against expectation. Sailors naturally think in terms of wind and waves because those forces are visible. You can see white caps. You can feel gusts. Currents, by contrast, require inference. Their presence is deduced from changes in speed, direction, and the behaviour of the water itself. Near the Cape, these signals are complicated by the meeting of the oceans, where multiple currents overlap and interfere. In calmer regions, currents tend to follow consistent paths. Sailors learn them, factor them into planning and move on. At the Cape, learning never quite finishes. The Agulhas current can accelerate unexpectedly. It can shift position. It can interact with eddies spinning off its main flow, creating pockets of stronger or weaker movement that are difficult to predict precisely. This unpredictability has consequences. A ship rounding the Cape might find itself pushed closer to shore than intended, even while steering away from it. The current does not care about coastline or hazard. It follows physics. If wind and wave combine with current in the wrong way, a vessel can lose the ability to manoeuvre effectively, particularly smaller ships, or those already under strain. Historically, this was devastating. In the age of sail, forward progress depended on wind direction and sail configuration. Fighting a strong current reduced speed dramatically. In some cases, ships were effectively pinned in place, making no progress for days while conditions worsened around them. Crews grew exhausted, supplies dwindled. The current continued patient and relentless. Logs from early voyages often mentioned strange delays near the Cape, unexplained slowdowns, or the feeling of being held in place. Without an understanding of oceanography, sailors struggled to explain what was happening. Some attributed it to opposing winds, others to faulty navigation. Only later did it become clear that water itself was moving beneath them, redirecting effort and eroding progress. The interaction between current and wind is particularly dangerous here. When strong winds blow against the Agulhas current, waves grow steeper and more unstable. The energy of the current forces water upward as wind pushes against it. The result is a sea that breaks more readily, producing short, violent waves capable of overwhelming ships. Many of the most dangerous sea states near the Cape occur not during the strongest storms, but during moderate winds opposing a strong current. These conditions have sunk modern ships as surely as they sank wooden ones centuries ago. Large vessels have suffered structural damage, smaller craft have capsized. Fishing boats, operating closer to shore where currents accelerate, face constant risk. Survivors often describe the same experience. The sea changed character rapidly. Waves became sharper. Control was lost not gradually, but suddenly. Currents also influence temperature, and temperature affects weather. Warm water releases heat into the air, feeding atmospheric instability. This can intensify local wind systems, creating feedback loops where current strengthens wind, and wind strengthens waves. Near the Cape, these interactions stack rather than cancel, producing conditions that feel disproportionate to the visible weather. For sailors, the psychological impact of currents is distinct from that of wind. Wind feels confrontational. You brace against it. You hear it. You react. Currents feel deceptive. You do not feel them directly. You discover their presence through failure. The ship is not where it should be. The plan does not unfold as expected. The sea quietly rewrites intentions. This deception breeds caution. Experienced captains learn to anticipate current even when it is not immediately evident. They compare speed through water with speed over ground. They monitor temperature changes. They watch the movement of debris and foam. Near the Cape, these observations become routine rather than optional. The phrase, pull like memory, captures something essential about these currents. Memory is not loud. It is persistent. It influences behavior long after the original event has passed. The Agulhas current carries the memory of winds and heat from far away, delivering that energy to the Cape long after its source has moved on. A storm thousands of kilometers north can shape conditions here days later, its influence preserved in moving water. This persistence is why conditions near the Cape can feel disconnected from immediate weather. The sky might appear manageable, the wind moderate, yet the sea behaves aggressively, driven by energy that arrived earlier and has not yet been spent. Sailors unfamiliar with this relationship may underestimate risk, assuming present conditions tell the full story. Modern forecasting models incorporate current data, but even they struggle with fine-scale interactions. Eddies break off unpredictably. Boundaries shift. Local topography alters flow. The result is a region where averages are less useful than vigilance. Sailors learn to treat every passage as unique. Currents also influence how ships recover from trouble. If a vessel loses power near the Cape, drift becomes a critical factor. The current can carry a disabled ship towards shore faster than expected. Emergency responses must account for this movement. Timeframes shrink. Decisions become urgent. Wrecks along the Cape's coastline often tell this story. Ships did not simply run aground because of storms. They were carried there, gradually or suddenly, by water moving beneath them. Even when anchors were deployed, holding ground could be unreliable in strong current and heavy seas. Local mariners understand these patterns intimately. They speak of certain areas where the water feels heavier, where lines pull harder, where boats respond sluggishly to helm input. These observations are not written on charts, but they are shared in conversation and experience. Knowledge here is practical, lived, and continually updated. The Cape's currents have also shaped ecosystems, drawing nutrients upward and supporting rich marine life. This abundance attracts fishing fleets, which must navigate the same dangers. Productivity and peril coexist, bound by the same moving water. The sea gives and takes without distinction. For sailors passing through rather than working these waters, currents remain an adversary to be respected rather than mastered. No amount of engine power eliminates their influence entirely. Even large ships adjust routes to minimize opposition. Patience becomes a strategy. Timing becomes critical. As vessels gradually move beyond the Cape and into waters where current behavior stabilizes, the tension begins to ease. The ship responds more predictably, plans hold longer. The sense of being quietly redirected fades, but the lesson remains. Sailors do not forget how easily intention can be bent by forces they cannot see. This memory influences future decisions. Routes are planned with greater margins. Schedules allow flexibility. Confidence is tempered. The Cape teaches that movement is not always a matter of force, but of understanding flow. And beneath that understanding lies a deeper realization. The ocean does not reset at each horizon. It carries its past forward, storing energy, transporting it patiently, releasing it where conditions allow. Currents are the ocean's memory, and near the Cape of Good Hope, that memory surfaces with enough strength to shape lives, ships, and stories alike. As we continue, it becomes clear that these underwater forces do not act alone. They interact constantly with surface conditions, with wind, with waves, with fatigue and decision-making. The Cape's danger is not one thing, but many working together, each reinforcing the other, creating a place where attention must remain steady long after the obvious threats have passed. There are storms that give you time to notice the sky changing, time to feel the air grow heavy, time to sense that something large is assembling itself beyond the horizon. Those storms announce their arrival slowly, with gathering clouds, falling pressure, and the kind of unease that builds over hours. Around the Cape of Good Hope, sailors have learned to fear a different kind of storm entirely. These are storms that seem to appear fully formed, as though they have stepped into existence rather than travelled toward it. The reason for this lies not in mystery, but in geography and physics working together in an unforgiving way. The Cape sits at the crossroads of multiple weather systems, where cold fronts sweeping eastward from the Southern Ocean collide with warmer air rising from lower latitudes. These fronts are fast-moving and powerful, and they do not always behave like the storm sailors encounter elsewhere. Instead of a long build-up, there can be a sharp transition. Conditions that feel manageable suddenly become hostile. A sailor might be standing watch under a sky that looks unsettled but not alarming. Clouds may be present, but not towering. The wind might be steady, even helpful. Then, sometimes within the span of an hour or less, the wind strengthens dramatically. Its direction shifts. Rain arrives not as a gradual curtain, but as a dense wall. Waves that were merely uncomfortable begin to break violently. The sea seems to tighten around the ship as though space itself has narrowed. Part of what makes these storms feel so sudden is the way they are fueled. Warm water from the Agulhas current releases heat into the air above it, providing energy that intensifies passing systems. When a cold front moves over this warm surface, the temperature contrast can sharpen rapidly, causing the storm to strengthen faster than forecasts might suggest. What might have been an ordinary front elsewhere becomes something far more aggressive here. Sailors often describe the first moments of these storms not as dramatic, but as confusing. Instruments begin to disagree. Wind readings climb quickly. The ship's motion changes in a way that feels wrong, rather than immediately dangerous. Then the realization settles in. This is not a passing squall. This is something that will demand attention for hours, perhaps longer. In the age of sail, these storms were especially devastating. Canvas could be reduced, but not instantly. Rigging took time to adjust. Crews had to work on deck in conditions that deteriorated rapidly, fighting wind that punished exposed skin and waves that swept across decks with little warning. Mistakes made in the early moments of a storm often determined whether a ship would survive the later stages. Historical accounts are filled with references to sudden gales near the Cape. Captains wrote of winds that rose with astonishing violence and seas that grew mountainous in a short space of time. These were not exaggerations meant to impress readers back home. They were attempts to explain how quickly control could slip away. What made matters worse was that these storms often arrived after long periods of strain. Ships approaching the Cape were rarely fresh. They had already endured weeks or months of difficult sailing. Crews were tired, equipment was worn. The margin for error was already thin. A storm born without warning pushed that margin to its limit. Even modern vessels equipped with engines, radar, and advanced forecasting remain vulnerable to this rapid escalation. Forecast models can predict large-scale systems, but the exact timing and intensity of front interaction near the Cape is still difficult to pin down. Local effects amplify global patterns, and small deviations can lead to large differences in outcome. For contemporary sailors, the danger lies not just in the storm itself, but in the assumptions made before it arrives. A forecast suggesting moderate conditions can encourage progress when caution might be wiser. When the storm then strengthens unexpectedly, options narrow quickly. Turning back may no longer be possible. Slowing down may expose the ship to worse angles of wave impact. Pressing on requires endurance and luck. The physical experience of these storms is overwhelming in a way that is difficult to convey fully. Wind presses continuously rather than gusting. The sound becomes a constant roar, drowning out conversation and even thought. Spray fills the air, reducing visibility to a few ship lengths. Rain stings rather than soaks, driven horizontally with force. Waves behave differently under these conditions. Instead of long, rolling swells, the sea becomes sharp and aggressive. Waves rise steeply and break early, slamming into hulls and superstructures. The ship's movement grows violent, with sudden drops and abrupt impacts that send shock through metal and bone alike. Everything not secured moves. Everything secured is tested. Inside the ship, the storm is never entirely shut out. Vibrations travel through the structure. Bulkheads creak. Loose items find new paths. The sense of motion is constant, making rest nearly impossible. Even lying down requires effort, bracing against the ship's unpredictable movements. Psychologically, storms born without warning are uniquely draining. There is little time to prepare mentally. The transition from relative calm to crisis is abrupt, leaving no gradual adjustment. Adrenaline spikes quickly, but cannot be sustained indefinitely. As hours pass, fatigue sets in, dulling reflexes and narrowing focus. Sailors learn to break time into manageable pieces. The next hour, the next watch, the next adjustment. Thinking beyond that feels overwhelming. The storm becomes the entire world, shrinking attention to immediate needs. Food is eaten quickly, if at all. Sleep is fragmented. The body exists in a state of constant readiness. One of the most dangerous aspects of these storms is how they interact with the other forces already present near the Cape. Wind strengthens waves already shaped by opposing currents. Rain reduces visibility near a coastline that offers little margin for navigation errors. Equipment failures caused by prolonged pounding become more likely at precisely the moment when reliability matters most. Many shipwrecks attributed to storms near the Cape were not caused by wind alone. They were the result of compounded stress, a weakened hull meeting steep waves, a tired crew misjudging a maneuver, a navigation error amplified by poor visibility and relentless drift. The storm did not need to be unprecedented, it only needed to arrive at the wrong time. Survivors of such storms often describe a lingering sense of disbelief afterward. Not because the danger was exaggerated, but because of how quickly it arrived. The contrast between before and after feels too sharp, as though memory has compressed events unnaturally. One moment there was caution, the next there was survival. This abruptness has shaped how sailors think about the Cape. They do not assume gradual escalation. They do not wait for obvious signs before acting. Preparations are made early. Safety margins are widened. There is an understanding that if a storm announces itself clearly, it may already be too late to respond optimally. Local mariners, especially those who work these waters regularly, develop an intuition for subtle changes, a shift in wind tone, a particular shape of cloud, a sudden change in sea texture. These signals are difficult to quantify, but they are respected. They represent lessons learned through repetition and loss. Technology has improved safety, but it has not removed the fundamental challenge. Radar can see rain bands approaching, but it cannot slow them down. Satellite data can show developing systems, but it cannot predict precisely how local currents and temperature gradients will intensify them near the Cape. Human judgment remains central. What makes storms born without warning especially unsettling is how they undermine the idea of control. Sailors prepare for storms they can see coming. They plan routes around systems. They choose windows of opportunity. When a storm forms or strengthens faster than expected, it reminds everyone aboard that preparation has limits. This does not mean that sailors are helpless. Skill, experience, and decision-making still matter enormously. Ships survive these storms every year. Crews endure them, adjust, and emerge intact. But survival is often measured not in comfort, but in damage avoided, rather than damage prevented entirely. After such a storm passes, the sea does not immediately return to calm. Residual waves continue to move through the area. Swells generated by distant winds arrive long after local conditions improve. The ship remains unsettled. The body remains tense. It takes time for normal rhythms to reassert themselves, and during that time, reflection sets in. Sailors replay decisions. They remember moments when things could have gone differently. They carry those memories forward, adjusting future behaviour accordingly. The Cape storms become part of their personal weather history, influencing how they rid skies and seas elsewhere. These storms also shape the stories told on land. Accounts shared in ports emphasise suddenness and intensity. They reinforce the Cape's reputation as a place where complacency is punished. Over time, these stories accumulate, blending individual experiences into a collective understanding that outlasts any single voyage. What emerges from all of this is not fear in the abstract, but vigilance. The kind of vigilance that does not relax simply because conditions look acceptable. Near the Cape, sailors learn to treat calm as provisional. They understand that the environment can change character quickly without ceremony. As ships move away from this region, storms continue to exist elsewhere, but they often feel different. They arrive with more warning. They behave in more familiar ways. The contrast is noticeable. The Cape storms leave an impression not because they are always the worst, but because they demand immediate respect. And woven through all of this is the understanding that storms are not isolated events. They are shaped by the same winds, currents, and temperature gradients that define the Cape itself. They are expressions of a system that does not pause to accommodate those passing through it. As the memory of the storm fades and the ship continues onward, another realization settles in. Even when the sky clears and the sea calms, the forces that created that sudden violence are still present, still moving, still capable of aligning again. The Cape does not exhaust its dangers in a single display, which is why sailors do not relax too quickly, and why the Cape remains a place spoken of carefully. Because beyond the storms themselves lie the consequences they leave behind, the exhaustion, the damage, the subtle erosion of confidence that follows any encounter with a force that arrived unannounced and departed on its own terms. And as we continue, those consequences begin to take shape in a different way, not in the sky or the sea, but in the quiet absence of ships that never made it through, leaving behind only questions, scattered wreckage, and a coastline that has witnessed far more endings than it ever promised to prevent. Some dangers announce themselves through noise and motion. Others leave their mark through silence. Around the Cape of Good Hope, one of the most enduring sources of fear has never been the storms themselves, nor the winds or the currents taken individually, but the absence that followed certain voyages. Ships that set out with crews, cargo, and clear intentions, and then simply did not arrive. No distress signals, no survivors. Sometimes not even wreckage. Just a gap in the record where a name once belonged. In the early centuries of global sea travel, this absence was deeply unsettling. Communication across oceans did not exist. A ship departed, and months later, it either appeared at its destination or it did not. When it failed to arrive, speculation filled the space left behind. Was it delayed? Had it been damaged and turned back? Or had it been claimed by the sea somewhere near that notorious southern tip of Africa? The Cape became associated with these disappearances not because every missing ship was lost there, but because so many were last reported near it. Logs mention passing the Cape, or being within sight of land, or battling conditions in its vicinity. And then the trail ends. For families waiting at home, for merchants expecting cargo, for governments tracking fleets, the Cape became a point where certainty dissolved into conjecture. The coastline itself offers some explanation. It is long, rugged, and exposed. Waves break hard against cliffs and reefs. Currents push relentlessly. When a ship was driven ashore here, there was often little chance of recovery. Wooden hulls shattered quickly. Iron ships twisted and broke apart under repeated impact. What remained was scattered by waves, pulled under by currents, or buried beneath shifting sand. In many cases, wreckage never surfaced in a recognizable form. The ocean does not preserve neatly. Timbers splinter, cargo disperses, heavy items sink. Lighter ones may drift far from the site of the disaster, arriving on distant shores stripped of context. Without survivors to tell the story, the cause of loss remained uncertain. Even when wreckage was found, it often raised more questions than answers. A broken mast washed ashore. A lifeboat overturned and empty. Pieces of hull bearing familiar markings. These fragments confirmed loss, but revealed little about how it happened. Was it a storm? A navigational error? A sudden shift in current? Or a sequence of smaller failures that compounded quietly until recovery was impossible? The Cape's reputation grew not through dramatic tales alone, but through these unresolved endings. Sailors spoke of ships that vanished between one port and the next, of captains who had crossed oceans successfully, only to be undone near the finish of a long passage, of crews who had survived months at sea only to disappear within sight of the land. One of the cruelest aspects of these losses was proximity. The Cape often lay at a turning point in the voyage. Once rounded, conditions might ease, routes opened, progress felt tangible. To lose a ship so close to that transition gave the disaster an added weight. It was not just loss, but loss after endurance. In the age of sail, this proximity could be deceptive. A ship might appear to be near safety simply because land was visible. But land near the Cape did not mean shelter. There were few harbours. The coastline offered little protection from onshore winds and heavy surf. Being driven toward land was often more dangerous than being pushed out to sea. Survivors of wrecks that did occur near the Cape described scenes of chaos and helplessness. Boats smashed before they could be launched. Crew thrown into cold, violent water. Waves dragging bodies back against rocks repeatedly. Even strong swimmers had little chance. Rescue from shore was rare, not for lack of will, but because conditions made it impossible. These realities filtered back into maritime culture slowly, through letters, rumours and official reports. Each disappearance added another layer to the Cape's reputation. Sailors learned to associate it not just with danger they could see, but with endings they could not explain. As shipbuilding improved and records became more systematic, patterns emerged. Certain seasons proved more dangerous than others. Specific stretches of coastline were identified as particularly lethal. Still, the sense of unpredictability remained. Two ships could sail the same route weeks apart and encounter entirely different outcomes. The 20th century did not end these losses. Steamships replaced sail, but they too fell victim to the Cape's conditions. Engines failed under sustained stress. Navigation errors occurred in poor visibility. Cargo ships ran aground when currents set them unexpectedly toward shore. Even with radio communication, not all distress calls were received or acted upon in time. Some ships vanished in the modern era as well, leaving behind only partial data. A final position transmitted, a last weather report, then silence. Investigations could reconstruct probable scenarios, but certainty remained elusive. The sea does not provide witness statements. For sailors, these stories matter deeply. They are not abstract statistics. Each missing ship represents colleagues, mentors, friends. Names remembered in ports and training halls, routes spoken of with lowered voices. The Cape becomes not just a geographic feature, but a memorial of sorts, marking where lives intersected with forces larger than any vessel. This legacy influences behaviour even today. Captains study past losses carefully. They note circumstances. They learn from decisions made by others who did not have the benefit of hindsight. The Cape's history becomes part of modern risk assessment, shaping how passages are planned and executed. There is also a quieter, personal aspect to these disappearances. Sailors carry the awareness that the sea does not guarantee return. This awareness is sharpened at places like the Cape, where loss has been frequent enough to feel almost routine, yet never normal. Each voyage is undertaken with the understanding that success is not owed. On land, the remains of some wrecks still surface after storms shift the sand. Timbers emerge briefly, then disappear again. Rusted metal breaks the surface before being reclaimed. These moments remind observers that history here is not buried neatly. It resurfaces unpredictably, just like the dangers that caused it. Local communities have long lived with this reality. Fishermen know which areas to avoid. Coastal residents grow accustomed to debris washing ashore. Memorials stand quietly, marking known losses while acknowledging countless others that were never fully documented. The sea around the Cape does not discriminate by size or era. Small vessels and large ones, wooden hulls and steel, ancient navigation and modern electronics, all are subject to the same underlying forces. This continuity is part of what makes the Cape's history feel heavy. Progress has reduced risk, but it has not erased it. For those who sail past this point successfully, the memory of ships that never returned often lingers longer than the memory of storms survived. Storms are experienced directly and then left behind. Absence follows you. It becomes part of the mental map, shaping caution and humility long after the physical danger has passed. And yet, shipping continues. It must. Trade depends on it. Livelihoods depend on it. Exploration, research and connection still require passage through this region. The Cape does not stop the world. It simply reminds it of limits. As vessels move onward, leaving the Cape astern, there is often a quiet acknowledgement among crew. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Recognition that many have not made this crossing. Recognition that success is not just a matter of skill, but of timing and circumstance. This acknowledgement does not end the story. It deepens it. Because beyond the vanished ships lies another layer of fear, one rooted not in history alone, but in the way sailors internalize these losses, shaping beliefs, habits, and rituals that persist even when danger feels distant. And as we continue, those beliefs begin to surface, revealing how the Cape's reputation lives not only in records and wrecks, but in the minds of those who approach it, carrying forward lessons written in absence rather than ink. When a place gathers danger slowly over centuries, people do not respond with statistics alone. They respond with habits, with stories repeated often enough to feel solid, with small rules that promise control where control is scarce. Around the Cape of Good Hope, sailors have always carried more than charts and tools with them. They carried beliefs, not always spoken aloud, not always defended logically, but followed all the same. Superstition at sea is not born from ignorance. It is born from exposure. Sailors spend long periods in environments where consequences are severe and explanations are often incomplete. When the same stretch of water produces loss again and again, patterns are sought. even if those patterns live outside formal science. The Cape, with its history of sudden storms, conflicting seas and vanished ships, became fertile ground for these beliefs. One of the oldest superstitions tied to the Cape involves behaviour before rounding it. Certain actions were discouraged, sometimes strictly. Whistling on deck was believed to summon unwanted wind, a belief shared across many maritime cultures, but treated with particular seriousness near this coastline. The logic was simple and unyielding. Wind was already unpredictable here. There was no need to invite more. Clothing carried meaning as well. Some sailors refused to change into new garments before passing the Cape, believing that doing so tempted fate. Others avoided washing certain items, not because of hygiene, but because familiarity was thought to matter. A shirt worn through previous storms had proven itself. A new one had not. Names mattered too. Ships approaching the Cape sometimes avoided speaking the names of certain vessels lost there, as though naming them might call their misfortune forward. Even the Cape itself was occasionally referred to indirectly, especially during difficult passages. This was not because sailors believed the land could hear them, but because language itself felt risky. Words had weight. Rituals developed around timing. Some crews waited for specific hours before altering course toward the Cape, even if conditions seemed acceptable earlier. Others insisted on particular watch arrangements, ensuring that experienced hands were present during key moments, not merely for practical reasons, but because those individuals were believed to carry luck earned through survival. Talismans were common, coins nailed to masts, small carvings tucked into pockets, pieces of rope from previous voyages kept close. These objects did not change wind or wave, but they changed something internal. They offered a sense of continuity, a reminder that the sailor had faced danger before and emerged intact. Near the Cape, that reminder mattered. Animals aboard ships carried their own symbolic roles. Cats were widely considered good luck, not only because they controlled vermin, but because their presence was thought to bring balance. A cat behaving calmly during rough weather was seen as reassurance. A cat acting strangely could cause unease, even if no one said it aloud. There were also superstitions about silence. Some crews believed that unnecessary noise angered the sea, particularly near dangerous headlands. Voices were kept low, laughter subdued, not out of fear alone, but out of a sense that this was a place where attention should be focused rather than scattered. Meals changed subtly during passages near the Cape. Certain foods were avoided, not because they caused illness, but because they were associated with past misfortune. A meal eaten before a difficult crossing that ended badly might never be served again on that ship. Food became part of the ship's memory. Perhaps the most enduring superstition was the idea that the Cape demanded respect rather than bravado. Sailors who boasted openly about easy passages were viewed with suspicion. Confidence was acceptable. Arrogance was not. Many believed that the Cape punished those who treated it lightly. This belief reinforced cautious behaviour in a way that no rulebook ever could. These superstitions were not uniform. They varied by culture, by era, by ship. Portuguese sailors brought different beliefs than Dutch or British crews. Later, steamship sailors adapted older rituals to new technology. What remained consistent was the impulse itself. When facing a place known for unpredictability, people sought patterns that made survival feel less arbitrary. Importantly, these beliefs often complemented practical seamanship rather than replacing it. A sailor who refused to whistle still reefed sails properly. A captain who followed ritual still studied weather reports. Superstition filled the gaps where knowledge ended, providing structure to uncertainty rather than denying reality. Psychologically, this mattered deeply. Fear at sea is not a sudden event. It is cumulative. Long watches, interrupted sleep, constant motion. Superstitions acted as anchors for the mind. They created moments of familiarity in environments where very little felt familiar. Near the Cape, where conditions could shift rapidly and violently, This mental anchoring was especially valuable. When storms arrived without warning, when currents pulled against the effort, when the sea behaved in ways that defied expectation, rituals provided a sense of participation rather than helplessness. Doing something, even symbolically, felt better than doing nothing. Modern sailors often dismiss superstition publicly, while practicing it privately. Electronic navigation and forecasting have replaced many uncertainties, but not all. Ask a seasoned mariner about rounding the Cape, and they may speak in technical terms first. But listen carefully and you'll hear echoes of older beliefs: extra caution, a preference for certain timings, a reluctance to tempt conditions unnecessarily. Some modern superstitions are subtle, avoiding certain jokes, delaying celebratory gestures until well clear of the region, keeping personal items in specific places. These habits are rarely labelled as superstition by those who practice them. They are simply how things are done. The persistence of these beliefs does not suggest ignorance, it suggests memory. Cultural memory shaped by experience passed down through generations. Even sailors who have never personally encountered extreme danger near the Cape know the stories. They have heard them in training, in ports, from mentors who survived difficult passages. The Cape's superstitions also served a social function. They reinforced group cohesion. When everyone followed the same rituals, a shared understanding emerged. This reduced conflict during stressful periods. It aligned attention. It created a collective rhythm that mirrored the need for coordination on deck. There were, of course, skeptics, sailors who mocked rituals openly. Some of them passed the Cape without incident, others did not. Survivorship bias ensured that stories supporting superstition travelled farther than those contradicting it. A sailor who ignored rituals and survived had little incentive to advertise it. One who ignored them and suffered misfortune became a cautionary tale. On land, these beliefs were often exaggerated. Stories told in taverns and homes transformed practical caution into mysticism. The Cape was portrayed as a place that demanded offerings or obedience. These exaggerations, while inaccurate, reinforced the idea that the region was different, deserving special treatment. Over time, superstition blended with tradition. What began as belief hardened into habit. What began as fear became etiquette. Sailors did not question why certain things were done. They only knew that they had always been done that way, especially here. Even today, training for difficult passages emphasises mindset as much as mechanics. Instructors stress respect for conditions, awareness of history, the importance of humility. These lessons may not be labelled as superstition, but they serve a similar purpose. They shape behaviour in ways that reduce risk. The Cape's superstitions persist because they align with reality often enough to feel justified. Recklessness is punished. Caution is rewarded. Whether this is coincidence or confirmation matters less than the outcome. Sailors who approach the Cape thoughtfully tend to fare better than those who do not. There is also something deeply human about creating meaning around danger. We do this everywhere, not just at sea. Mountains develop legends, deserts acquire taboos. The Cape, sitting at the intersection of powerful forces, became a canvas for this instinct. These beliefs do not disappear simply because science advances. Instead, they evolve. They become quieter, less explicit, woven into professional judgment rather than spoken as rules. A captain may say they are delaying departure due to conditions, but beneath that decision may live an inherited caution shaped by centuries of experience. As ships pass the Cape today, crew members may not nail coins to masts or whisper prayers aloud, but many still feel the shift, a tightening of focus, a subtle seriousness, an understanding that this is not the place to cut corners. Superstition, in this sense, is not about believing the sea listens. It is about acknowledging that humans do not control it. The rituals are reminders of that imbalance. They reinforce patience, attention, and restraint. And as vessels move beyond the Cape and into more predictable waters, some of these habits relax. Laughter returns, routine resumes, the invisible rules loosen their grip. But they are not forgotten. They remain ready, waiting for the next approach, the next moment when the Cape reasserts its influence. Because beyond storms and currents and wrecks, what truly terrifies sailors is not the idea of danger itself, but the awareness that danger here does not always follow logic as neatly as they would like. Superstition fills that gap, offering structure where certainty fails, and as we move forward, it becomes clear that these beliefs are not relics of the past. They continue to shape how sailors think, plan and feel, especially when approaching a place that has spent centuries teaching the same lesson in different ways, that respect is not optional, and that confidence without humility rarely survives the passage. Long before weather satellites traced storms in neat spirals, before engines could push against wind with mechanical certainty, and before charts began to resemble the coastlines they claimed to represent, there were voices. Not voices amplified by instruments or preserved in recordings, but voices scratched into paper, carried home in letters, journals and official reports written by men who had faced the Cape with little more than wood, canvas and belief. These voices from the age of exploration do not speak in the language of drama the way later retellings often do. They are quieter, more restrained, and in many ways more unsettling because of it. They describe fear without naming it directly. They document hardship without embellishment, and again, when their ships approach the southern tip of Africa, their tone changes. Early Portuguese accounts are among the first to capture this shift. Sailors who had hugged the African coast for months suddenly found themselves pushed into unfamiliar waters. Winds no longer behaved as expected. Currents worked against progress. The sea's motion became irregular, heavy, and exhausting. In their writings, you can sense confusion giving way to caution, and caution giving way to something closer to reverence. Captains wrote of days lost to headwinds that did not appear on departure, of ships driven southward against intention, of waves that struck from angles that made steering feel imprecise. These were not men unfamiliar with danger. They had already crossed vast stretches of open ocean, yet the Cape unsettled them in ways they struggled to articulate. What stands out in these early voices is how often they describe feeling tested rather than attacked. The sea was not portrayed as violent for its own sake. It was portrayed as relentless. Progress slowed. Plans dissolved. Decisions had to be revisited constantly. This erosion of certainty weighed heavily on crews already stretched thin by months at sea. Some journals describe moments when land was sighted and relief briefly surged, only to be replaced by frustration when that land offered no shelter. Crews realised that proximity did not equate to safety. The coastline they could see was steep, exposed, and unforgiving. Being driven toward it felt more dangerous than remaining in open water. These accounts often mention exhaustion in understated ways, hands raw from working lines in cold spray, sleep disrupted by constant motion, food becoming less appealing not because of scarcity, but because of fatigue. The Cape did not need to kill to weaken. It wore people down quietly. Dutch voices joined these Portuguese ones as trade expanded. The Dutch East India Company relied heavily on routes past the Cape, and their records are meticulous. Logbooks tracked wind direction, sea state, and progress with obsessive detail. When ships struggled near the Cape, those details multiplied. Entries grew longer. Language became cautious. Words like uncertain, variable, and contrary appeared frequently. One recurring theme in these voices is surprise, not at storms alone, but at how quickly conditions changed. A favourable wind could turn hostile within hours. A steady course could become impossible to hold. Sailors learned not to trust brief calm. They learned that the Cape demanded sustained attention rather than momentary vigilance. English accounts from later expeditions echo these sentiments. By the time British ships rounded the Cape regularly, its reputation was already well established. Yet even with warnings and experience to draw upon, the reality continued to unsettle. Captains wrote of expecting difficulty and still being caught off guard. What is particularly striking is how these voices rarely describe the Cape as a single event. It is not framed as a storm to be survived and forgotten. Instead, it is described as a phase, a prolonged period of heightened difficulty. Days blur together. Progress is measured slowly. Relief does not arrive immediately upon passing a specific point. The Cape's influence lingers. There are also voices that speak of loss indirectly, a mention of reduced crew numbers without explanation, a brief note about cargo shifted or damaged, an absence of detail where detail would normally appear. These silences suggest moments that were too painful, too complex, or too unresolved to describe fully. Some sailors recorded prayers or appeals in their journals, not as grand declarations, but as practical acknowledgements of vulnerability. Others noted rituals observed more carefully near the Cape. These entries reinforce the idea that superstition and seamanship were intertwined, especially when facing conditions that defied prediction. Interestingly, not all voices are fearful. Some speak with a kind of grim admiration. They note the scale of the sea, the power of the wind, the persistence of the current. There is respect here, even pride in having endured. But admiration does not erase caution. It sits alongside it, reinforcing the idea that survival does not equal mastery. As navigation improved and maps became more accurate, the voices did not lose their edge. Later explorers still wrote of difficulty near the Cape. Better charts helped avoid certain hazards, but they did not change the fundamental behaviour of wind and water. The Cape remained a place where theory met resistance. These historical voices also reveal something about leadership under strain. Captains wrote of disagreements among officers, of difficult decisions about whether to press on or wait, of weighing the morale of the crew against the risk of delay. Near the Cape, leadership was tested as much as ships were. Crew members' accounts, when they survive, are often more visceral. They speak of cold, of fear, of the sense that the sea behaved differently here. Their language is less technical, more immediate. They remember sounds, sensations, moments when they believed the ship would not hold. What unites all these voices is a shared recognition that the Cape did not behave like other places. It resisted easy categorization. It punished assumptions. It demanded patience and humility in equal measure. Over time, these accounts layered upon one another, building a collective memory that extended far beyond individual experience. This collective memory influenced future voyages profoundly. Sailors approached the Cape already primed for difficulty. They expected resistance. They prepared mentally and materially. Yet preparation did not eliminate fear. It refined it. The age of exploration was not an era of reckless bravery alone. It was an era of learning through repetition, often painful repetition. The Cape served as a harsh instructor. Its lessons were recorded not in triumphal language, but in careful notes and restrained warnings. As centuries passed, these voices did not fade. They were quoted, summarized, and passed down through training and tradition. Even sailors who never read original journals absorbed their essence. The idea that the Cape was different, demanding, and unforgiving became embedded in maritime culture. What makes these voices powerful is not that they exaggerate danger, but that they normalize caution. They show experienced sailors grappling with uncertainty honestly. They admit limits. They acknowledge fear without surrendering to it. In listening to these voices now, long after the ships that carried them have vanished, we hear more than history. We hear the origins of a mindset that persists today, a mindset shaped not by myth alone, but by lived experience recorded carefully and shared widely. As modern ships pass the same waters, their crews inherit this legacy whether they realize it or not. The words may not be quoted directly, but their influence lingers in planning, in hesitation, in respect. And as we move forward, those voices blend with newer ones, forming a continuous thread that stretches from the first tentative voyages to the present day. The Cape remains the same teacher it has always been, patient, indifferent, and persistent, waiting for each generation to listen in its own way, just as those early sailors once did, writing quietly while the sea moved around them, shaping lessons that would outlast them by centuries. From a distance, it might seem puzzling that the Cape of Good Hope still commands such caution. Ships today are larger than small towns. Hulls are welded steel rather than timber. Engines can push against wind with steady force. Satellites track weather systems days in advance. Every movement is logged, monitored, and calculated. And yet, when modern ships approach this stretch of water, behaviour changes in ways that feel familiar to sailors from centuries past. The respect is not ceremonial, it is operational. It shows up in route planning meetings, in conservative speed choices, in decisions to wait rather than press forward. It shows up in the way captains speak more carefully, in the way watch schedules tighten, in the way margins are widened without being announced. The Cape does not inspire fear because it is poorly understood. It inspires respect because it is understood well enough. Modern ships operate on schedules that leave little room for unpredictability. Cargo deadlines matter. Fuel efficiency is calculated to the decimal. Delays ripple through supply chains that stretch across continents. Under normal circumstances, ships are encouraged to maintain speed and optimize routes. Near the Cape, that mindset softens. Efficiency yields to resilience. One reason is scale itself. Large ships are powerful, but they're also slow to respond. Their mass gives them stability, but it also limits agility. In confused seas where waves arrive from multiple directions and periods, this mass becomes a liability. The ship cannot ride the water lightly. It meets every wave with force. Each impact transfers energy through the structure, stressing joints, welds, and cargo securing systems. Container ships are particularly vulnerable in this regard. Their towering stacks create windage, increasing the force exerted by strong winds. When these winds interact with opposing currents, the resulting wave patterns can cause violent rolling. Containers are designed to be secured for heavy weather, but repeated irregular motion increases the risk of lashing failures. Entire stacks have been lost overboard near the Cape, even in conditions that did not appear extreme on paper. Tankers face a different set of challenges. Their long, continuous hulls are susceptible to bending stress in heavy seas. When waves strike from awkward angles, the hull can flex repeatedly. Modern engineering accounts for this, but sustained punishment shortens fatigue life. Captains know this. They adjust course and speed to minimize stress, even if it means delay. Then there are bulk carriers, often heavily laden and slow to maneuver. In rough conditions near the Cape, their ability to respond to sudden changes is limited. If a wave breaks unexpectedly across the deck, water ingress becomes a serious concern. Modern ships have improved drainage and watertight integrity, but physics remains unforgiving. Technology does not remove the Cape's influence, it reframes it. Weather forecasts provide broad awareness, but they cannot capture every local interaction between wind, current, and topography. Models smooth reality. The Cape thrives in the details models struggle with. A slight shift in wind direction, a strengthening of current overnight, a front arriving 6 hours earlier than predicted. Modern captains are trained to read these uncertainties. They do not treat forecasts as guarantees. Near the Cape, forecasts are interpreted conservatively. If conditions are predicted to worsen, ships slow early rather than react late. If timing is unfavourable, some vessels choose to hold position offshore, burning fuel intentionally to avoid worse seas closer in. This willingness to wait is one of the clearest signs of respect. Time at sea costs money. Waiting costs more. Choosing to wait anyway signals a calculation shaped by experience. The Cape has taught that impatience can be far more expensive than delay. Automation has changed bridge operations, but it has not eliminated the need for judgment. Autopilots function best in predictable conditions. In confused seas, manual control becomes preferable. Helmsmen feel the ship more directly. Subtle changes in motion are noticed sooner. Near the Cape, human hands often return to the wheel. Crew management also reflects this respect. Rest schedules are adjusted to ensure alertness during key periods. Maintenance tasks that can wait are postponed. Non-essential movement on deck is restricted. These choices are not dramatic. They are practical. They reduce risk incrementally, acknowledging that small margins matter here. Communication with shore becomes more frequent. Companies want updates. Insurance interests pay attention. The Cape is not treated as routine water. It is flagged internally as a region where incidents are statistically more likely. That knowledge shapes policy as much as personal judgment. Even search and rescue planning reflects this caution. Authorities understand that response near the Cape is complicated by distance, weather, and sea state. Ships know that assistance may not arrive quickly. This awareness sharpens self-reliance. Decisions are made with the understanding that recovery options are limited. Modern navigation systems display current data, wave height, and wind vectors in real time. These tools are invaluable, but they also reveal complexity. Near the Cape, screens fill with competing arrows and overlays. Information increases, but certainty does not necessarily follow. Experienced officers learn to prioritize signals, filtering noise from relevance. There is also the matter of crew psychology. Many sailors today come from diverse backgrounds, some with limited experience in southern waters. For them, the Cape can be a first encounter with sustained heavy conditions. Officers know this. They prepare crews mentally as well as technically. Briefings emphasize what to expect, not to alarm but to align expectations. This alignment matters. Surprise increases stress, anticipation reduces it. Even when conditions turn difficult, crews who expected difficulty cope better. The Cape's reputation, passed down through training and conversation, serves a practical function here. It frames experience before it arrives. Modern ships also carry the weight of legal and financial consequence. An incident near the Cape attracts scrutiny. Investigations follow. Decisions are reviewed. Captains know their choices will be examined later with the benefit of hindsight. This encourages conservative judgment. Risk is justified carefully if at all. Despite all this, ships do not avoid the Cape entirely. Alternatives exist, but they are often longer, more expensive, or impractical. The Cape remains a vital artery in global trade, especially for routes that bypass canals or accommodate vessels too large for narrow passages. Respect does not mean avoidance, it means engagement with awareness. What is striking is how often modern sailors echo the language of their predecessors, even unintentionally. They speak of windows of opportunity, of reading the sea, of giving the Cape room. These phrases reflect continuity. Technology has changed, but mindset has not evolved as far as one might expect. The Cape also benefits from comparison. Sailors who have crossed many regions recognize its distinctiveness. They may face typhoons elsewhere, hurricanes in other oceans, but the Cape's danger feels different, less explosive, more persistent. It does not overwhelm instantly. It erodes steadily. This erosion is what modern risk models sometimes underestimate. Systems are good at identifying extreme events. They are less effective at accounting for sustained moderate stress. The Cape specializes in sustained stress. Hours of pounding, days of uneven motion, fatigue that accumulates quietly until something gives. Engineers design ships to withstand this, but design is not destiny. Maintenance quality matters, loading matters, crew response matters. Near the Cape, these variables converge under pressure. Respect becomes a way of managing uncertainty rather than eliminating it. There is also an emotional aspect that rarely appears in reports. Even seasoned sailors describe a subtle shift when approaching the Cape, a seriousness that settles in, not fear, but focus, the sense that this is not a place to be distracted, that small errors will not be forgiven easily. This seriousness dissipates slowly after passing through. The sea may calm, the wind may ease, but crews remain alert for some time afterward. The body remembers, muscles stay tense longer than necessary. Sleep returns gradually. The Cape leaves an imprint that does not fade immediately. For shipping companies, this imprint informs policy. For sailors, it informs instinct. Together they form a layered respect that has endured despite radical changes in technology. The Cape has not adapted to human progress. Humans have adapted to the Cape. That adaptation is visible in charts, in procedures, in training manuals. It is also visible in pauses, in delays chosen deliberately, in routes adjusted by small degrees. It is visible in decisions not taken. The modern world often assumes that knowledge dissolves fear. At the Cape, knowledge refines it. Understanding the forces at work does not make them smaller. It makes their interactions clearer, and clarity reveals complexity rather than simplicity. This is why modern ships still respect the Cape, not because it is mysterious, but because it is honest. It behaves according to physical laws that do not bend for convenience. It reveals weaknesses rather than hiding them. It rewards patience more often than speed. As ships continue their passage beyond this point, attention gradually broadens again. Systems relax. Routine resumes. The Cape recedes into memory, joining others that have passed safely. But it does not vanish entirely. It remains present in planning for the next voyage, the next approach, the next decision where caution outweighs urgency. And in that persistence lies the Cape's true power. It does not need to announce itself loudly to be remembered. It teaches through repetition, reinforcing lessons that no amount of technology has managed to erase. As we move forward, that respect begins to intersect with something quieter and more personal. The way prolonged exposure to such places shapes the inner landscape of those who pass through them. How fear, fatigue and responsibility mingle at sea, especially when the horizon offers no immediate reassurance, and the next decision must be made with a clear mind in an environment that resists clarity. There is a particular kind of darkness that settles over the ocean at night, one that feels heavier the farther you are from land, and more deliberate the closer you come to places known for difficulty. Nightfall near the Cape of Good Hope carries that weight in a way sailors rarely forget. It is not simply the absence of daylight. It is a shift in awareness, a narrowing of perception, a moment when the sea seems to reclaim space that light had briefly held at bay. During the day, even rough conditions offer visual context. You can see the shape of waves forming. You can judge distance. You can read the sky. At night, those cues thin out. The ocean becomes a surface you feel rather than see. Motion is sensed through the body instead of the eyes. Sound takes on greater importance, every impact and rush of water amplified by darkness. Near the Cape, this transition is especially unsettling because the environment does not calm itself for the night. Winds do not ease out of courtesy. Currents continue their work uninterrupted. Storm systems move according to pressure and temperature, not circadian rhythm. Darkness removes information without removing threat. For sailors standing watch at night, attention tightens. The horizon disappears. Sea and sky merge into a single mass. Navigation lights become critical reference points, small islands of certainty in an otherwise undefined space. When another vessel appears, its lights seem closer than they are, floating without context until distance resolves itself slowly. The coastline, when visible at all, is rarely comforting. The cliffs and headlands of the Cape do not glow softly under moonlight. They appear as darker shapes against darker water, their outlines distorted by mist, spray, and shifting angles of view. Lighthouses punctuate this darkness, but even they feel less reassuring here. Reminders not of safety, but of hazard. Many sailors describe a heightened sense of vulnerability at night near the Cape, not because danger increases in absolute terms, but because response time shrinks. A problem detected visually during daylight might go unnoticed until it becomes more serious after dark. A shift in sea state may be felt only once it is already established. Fatigue plays a critical role. By the time ships approach the Cape, crews are often already tired. Long voyages, disrupted sleep and sustained attention take their toll. Night demands alertness, when the body naturally wants to withdraw. This tension between biological rhythm and operational necessity is never resolved completely. Watches are structured carefully, but no schedule eliminates fatigue. Sailors learn to recognize it in themselves and others. Speech slows. Movements become more deliberate. Decision-making requires more effort. Near the Cape, these signs are taken seriously. Officers monitor not just instruments but people. The psychological effect of night is subtle and cumulative. Darkness encourages inward focus. Thoughts narrow. Concerns grow larger in the absence of visual reassurance. Even experienced sailors find their minds revisiting worst-case scenarios more readily at night. The stories of vanished ships, of sudden storms, of unseen currents feel closer when the sea is invisible. Sound becomes a primary source of information. The rhythm of waves against the hull, the pitch of the wind, the creak of structure under load. Sailors learn to interpret these sounds instinctively. A change in tone can indicate shifting conditions. An unfamiliar noise can prompt immediate investigation. Near the Cape, these sounds are rarely constant. The sea's confusion produces irregular impacts. The ship slams, then rolls, then slams again from a different angle. This unpredictability keeps nerves taut. There is no lull long enough to fully relax. The darkness also complicates navigation. While modern ships rely heavily on electronic systems, visual confirmation remains important. Radar helps, but it cannot replace human judgment entirely. Rain and heavy seas can clutter displays. False echoes appear. The watch officer must interpret data carefully, knowing that mistakes carry greater consequence near land. Moonlight, when present, offers limited comfort. A bright moon can illuminate wave crests, revealing patterns otherwise hidden, but it can also create illusions, flattening depth perception and masking the true height of waves. Reflections shimmer unpredictably, making it harder to judge motion accurately. On moonless nights, the ocean becomes a void, black water against black sky. The sense of scale vanishes. Ships feel smaller, more exposed. The knowledge that vast forces are moving beneath the surface becomes more abstract and therefore more unsettling. Weather changes at night can feel more abrupt. A shift in wind direction might be noticed first as a change in sound rather than sight. Rain arrives without warning, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The transition from manageable to dangerous can feel instantaneous. Historically, night near the Cape was a time of particular dread. Sailing ships relied heavily on visual cues. Without them, navigation was slower and riskier. Many captains chose to heave to or reduce speed after dark when conditions were uncertain, preferring delay to disaster. Modern ships maintain speed more often, but caution remains. Engines may be throttled back. Courses adjusted slightly offshore to increase margin. These decisions are rarely dramatic. They are quiet acknowledgements of reduced tolerance for surprise. Below deck, night changes little in terms of noise or motion. The sea does not respect interior spaces. Vibrations travel through the structure. Sleep is shallow. Crew members brace themselves unconsciously even when lying down, bodies adapting to constant movement. Dreams, when they come, are often fragmented. Sailors speak of half-sleep, where awareness never fully switches off. This state is exhausting but common during prolonged heavy conditions. Near the Cape, It is expected rather than avoided. There is also the awareness of isolation. While modern communication allows contact with shore, the reality remains that immediate help is unlikely. At night, this knowledge feels heavier. The horizon offers no reassurance. The sense of self-reliance sharpens. This isolation is not always frightening. For some, it brings clarity. Distractions fade. Attention focuses on essentials. The sea demands presence. In those moments, night becomes not an enemy, but a teacher, stripping away excess and leaving only what matters. Still, the mental load is real. The responsibility borne by officers during night watches near the Cape is significant. They must balance caution with progress, fatigue with vigilance, trust in systems with skepticism. Every decision carries weight. Crew interactions reflect this seriousness. Conversation is minimal, humour is subdued, orders are brief and clear. The ship functions as a single organism, each part responding to subtle cues. Lighthouses, when visible, mark known hazards rather than safety. Their beams sweep across water that remains just as dangerous beyond their reach. They serve as reminders of proximity to land, not of refuge. For sailors unfamiliar with southern waters, night near the Cape can be a formative experience. It recalibrates expectations. The ocean feels larger, the ship feels smaller. Confidence becomes quieter, less performative. Veteran sailors often describe a sense of relief not at dawn itself, but at the gradual return of visual information. The sky lightens imperceptibly. The horizon reappears. Waves regain shape. With light comes context, and with context comes a measure of calm. But dawn does not erase what night revealed. The memory of darkness lingers. Decisions made under limited information are remembered. The body remains alert longer than necessary. The Cape does not release its hold easily. As ships move farther from the coast, the night begins to feel different. Darkness remains, but its character changes. The sea settles into a more predictable rhythm. The mind relaxes incrementally. The Cape recedes, not just geographically, but psychologically. Yet for many sailors, nightfall near the Cape becomes a reference point. Other nights at sea are measured against it. Calm elsewhere feels deeper by comparison. Danger elsewhere feels more manageable. This lasting impression is part of why the Cape continues to command respect. It teaches sailors what darkness can remove and what must remain when vision fails. It reveals reliance on senses beyond sight. It reinforces humility. As we continue, this interplay between fear, fatigue, and focus becomes even more personal. Beyond the external forces of wind and water lies the internal landscape sailors navigate, shaped by long hours, responsibility, and the quiet knowledge that some places demand more from those who pass through them than others ever will. Fear at sea is rarely sudden. It does not usually arrive as panic or shouting or loss of control. More often, it arrives quietly, layered on top of exhaustion, responsibility, and the unbroken line of water stretching to every horizon. Near the Cape of Good Hope, this quiet fear has space to grow, not because sailors are weak or unprepared, but because the environment invites it to linger. By the time a ship approaches this region, fatigue is almost always present. Long voyages do not offer the kind of rest found on land. Sleep comes in fragments. Watches interrupt nights. Motion never fully stops. Even in calm conditions, the body remains slightly braced, muscles holding tension they never quite release. Near the Cape, where conditions demand heightened attention, that background fatigue becomes impossible to ignore. Fatigue changes perception. Small problems feel larger. Decisions take longer to make. Confidence softens into caution. This is not failure, it is physiology. The human brain, when tired, prioritizes safety over speed, certainty over optimism. At the Cape, this instinct aligns with reality often enough to be reinforced. Fear emerges from this state not as a sharp emotion, but as awareness. Awareness of how many variables are in play. Awareness of how little control any one person truly has. Awareness of stories heard and remembered, of ships that struggled here, of nights when things went wrong faster than anyone expected. The open horizon contributes to this feeling in subtle ways. At sea, the horizon is both freedom and threat. It represents movement, possibility, progress. It also represents exposure. There is nowhere to hide, nowhere to retreat to quickly. Near the Cape, this openness feels amplified. Land exists, but it does not offer comfort. The horizon remains dominant. For sailors standing watch, staring into that open horizon hour after hour, the mind fills in gaps left by darkness, mist, or distance. Thoughts drift toward contingencies. What if the wind shifts again? What if the engine falters? What if visibility drops further? These thoughts are not irrational. They are rehearsals, quiet mental preparations for situations that experience has taught are possible. Responsibility intensifies this mental load. Officers on watch carry the weight of the ship and everyone aboard it. Every choice, from small course adjustments to decisions about speed, carries consequence. Near the Cape, those consequences feel closer. The margin for error feels thinner, even when instruments suggest otherwise. Fatigue makes this responsibility heavier. A well-rested mind can hold multiple scenarios without strain. A tired one narrows focus. This narrowing can be useful, but it also limits flexibility. Sailors learn to recognize this state, to compensate by double-checking decisions, by involving others, by slowing processes rather than rushing them. Fear in this context is not paralysis. It is friction. It slows movement just enough to encourage care. The Cape teaches this repeatedly. Ships that push through fatigue without acknowledging it often pay a price. Ships that respect it tend to fare better. Crew dynamics shift under this pressure. Conversation becomes functional. Humour fades. There is less energy for social interaction. This is not unhappiness. It is conservation. Energy is reserved for tasks that matter. Bonds tighten quietly, expressed through shared vigilance rather than words. The open horizon also plays tricks on time. Hours stretch, watches blur together. Without landmarks, progress feels abstract. Near the Cape, where conditions resist smooth passage, this abstraction deepens. You are moving, but not always in a way that feels productive. Distance covered may be less than expected. Effort feels disproportionate to result. This mismatch feeds fatigue further. The body works harder for smaller gains. The mind searches for resolution that does not arrive quickly. Sailors learn to break time down into manageable segments. The next watch, the next course check, the next weather update. Thinking beyond that invites overwhelm. Fear sharpens senses, but sustained fear exhausts them. Near the Cape, sailors walk a careful line. They must remain alert without becoming consumed. This balance is learned, not taught. It comes from repetition, from nights spent staring into dark water, from mornings that arrive slowly. The open horizon offers no reassurance that conditions will improve soon. Unlike coastal sailing elsewhere, there is no promise of shelter just beyond sight. The Cape's geography denies that comfort. You're either in it or beyond it. There is no halfway refuge. This reality influences decision-making deeply. Captains weigh the cost of pressing on against the cost of waiting. Waiting at sea is not rest. It is often just another form of exposure, but sometimes it is the lesser strain. Choosing between imperfect options becomes routine. Fatigue also affects how fear is remembered. Survivors of difficult passages often recall emotional intensity more than physical detail. They remember the sense of weight, of pressure, of responsibility. The Cape lodges itself in memory not as a single moment, but as a prolonged state. This memory influences future voyages. Sailors approach the Cape already aware of how draining it can be. They prepare mentally, not just materially. They lower expectations of comfort. They accept that tiredness will come, and that managing it is part of the passage. The open horizon, in this way, becomes a mirror. It reflects internal states as much as external reality. Calm minds see possibility. Tired minds see risk. Neither is wrong. Both are part of navigating safely. What makes the Cape particularly effective at eliciting this response is its duration. It does not confront sailors briefly and then release them. It holds them in a state of heightened awareness for extended periods. Fear and fatigue have time to interact, to reinforce each other. Yet this interaction also builds resilience. Sailors who pass through learn something about their limits. They learn how much focus they can sustain. They learn how to ask for support before judgment falters. They learn to trust procedures when intuition weakens, and to trust intuition when data feels incomplete. The open horizon does not close as the Cape recedes. It remains, but its character changes. The sea may settle, the wind may ease, the body begins to recover, but the lessons remain active, shaping responses elsewhere. This is why sailors speak of the Cape with a seriousness that outsiders sometimes misinterpret as fear. It is not fear of catastrophe alone. It is fear of erosion, of being worn down until a small mistake becomes decisive. That awareness is sobering. As ships move onward, the fatigue slowly lifts. Sleep deepens. Muscles relax. Conversation returns. But something stays sharpened. A sensitivity to change. A respect for prolonged stress. Fear, fatigue, and the open horizon form a quiet triangle here. Each reinforces the others. None can be eliminated entirely. The goal is not to banish them, but to manage their interaction. The Cape teaches that safety is not achieved by confidence alone, nor by caution alone, but by awareness maintained over time. It teaches that fear, when acknowledged, can guide rather than hinder. That fatigue, when respected, can be managed rather than denied. And as the ship continues beyond this point, those lessons do not fade. They travel with the crew, informing future decisions, future nights, future horizons. Because the open horizon is always there, waiting. And once you've learned how it feels to face it while tired and responsible, in a place that offers little forgiveness, you do not forget. You carry that understanding forward, quietly, just as the sea carries its currents, shaping behaviour long after the immediate danger has passed. Long after the waves have softened and the wind has settled into something more predictable, the Cape of Good Hope remains present in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not sailed it. It does not linger as a vivid image or a dramatic memory. Instead, it settles into the sailor's mind as a reference point, a quiet benchmark against which other experiences are measured. The Cape becomes a place you carry with you, rather than leave behind. Not because it demands attention afterward, but because it subtly reshapes how attention works. Sailors who have passed it notice changes in themselves that emerge gradually, often without conscious awareness. Decisions elsewhere are made with slightly wider margins. Weather that once felt merely inconvenient now prompts earlier consideration. Fatigue is recognised sooner, before it becomes dangerous. This mental imprint is not rooted in fear alone. It is rooted in calibration. The Cape recalibrates what difficulty feels like. After enduring days of confused seas, relentless wind and limited rest, other challenges seem more manageable. Not because they are smaller in absolute terms, but because the internal scale has shifted. Many sailors struggle to articulate this shift. When asked about the Cape, they rarely recount specific moments unless prompted. Instead, they speak in generalities. They say it demands respect, or that it makes you pay attention. These phrases sound vague, but they point towards something precise. The Cape forces sustained awareness in a way few other places do. This awareness becomes internalized. Sailors begin to anticipate complexity even in environments that appear straightforward. They trust calm less blindly. They read signs more carefully. The Cape teaches that surface conditions rarely tell the full story. and that lesson travels far beyond southern Africa. Memory plays an important role here. Human memory does not store continuous experience evenly. It compresses long periods of sustained stress into a single impression. The Cape becomes one such impression. Not a sequence of events, but a state of being. Alert, tired, responsible, present. This state resurfaces unexpectedly. A sailor might find themselves in another ocean years later, facing heavy weather, and feel a familiar tightening of focus. The Cape is not physically present, but its imprint is. It informs response without needing to be recalled explicitly. There's also a shared mental landscape among sailors who have passed this way. Conversations between them often include subtle cues of recognition. A nod when the Cape is mentioned. A brief pause before moving on. They understand that the place occupies a particular corner of experience that does not require explanation. This shared understanding contributes to maritime culture. Training programs, mentoring relationships, and informal advice often reference the Cape indirectly. Instructors speak of southern conditions or places where systems overlap. The Cape does not always need to be named, its influence is assumed. The sailor's mind also retains the Cape as a lesson in limits. Modern life often emphasizes control, optimization, and efficiency. At sea, especially near the Cape, these ideals soften. Control becomes conditional. Optimization becomes situational. Efficiency yields to survival. This shift can be unsettling for those accustomed to predictability. It forces acceptance of uncertainty without surrendering responsibility. The Cape teaches that not all variables can be mastered, but decisions must still be made. For many sailors, this lesson extends beyond the profession. They find themselves more patient elsewhere, less reactive, more inclined to pause before committing to a course of action. The Cape's influence seeps quietly into everyday thinking. There is also a humility that settles in. Not the kind that diminishes confidence, but the kind that tempers it. Sailors who have faced the Cape rarely boast about it. They do not frame it as a conquest. They frame it as something they pass through, with effort and attention. This humility is reinforced by history. The Cape is not impressed by individual skill alone. It has witnessed centuries of capable sailors struggle and fail. Knowing this places personal success in context. Survival feels earned, but not owned. The sailor's mind also retains the Cape as a reminder of endurance rather than intensity. Unlike sudden crises that spike adrenaline and then resolve, the Cape stretches endurance over time. It demands sustained effort without offering dramatic release. This kind of challenge reshapes patience. Patience becomes an active skill rather than passive waiting. It involves monitoring, adjusting, conserving energy, and accepting slow progress. Sailors who internalize this skill carry it forward into other demanding situations. Another subtle imprint involves trust. Near the Cape, sailors learn to trust processes rather than impulses. When fatigue sets in, instinct may push toward shortcuts. The Cape punishes shortcuts. It rewards adherence to fundamentals, checklists, redundancy, conservative judgment. This reinforces respect for routine, even when routine feels tedious. The sailor's mind learns that boredom is preferable to surprise, that repetition is protective, that vigilance is rarely glamorous. The Cape also reshapes how sailors think about fear. Fear here is not an emergency response. It is a background awareness. It does not demand immediate action. It informs posture, readiness, and restraint. Sailors learn to coexist with it rather than fight it. This coexistence becomes valuable elsewhere. In high-stress environments, sailors who have passed the Cape often remain steadier. They recognize fear as information rather than instruction. They do not ignore it, but they do not let it dictate behavior unexamined. The open horizon near the Cape also alters perception of scale. The ocean feels vast everywhere, but here it feels particularly dominant. Land offers little comfort. Help feels distant. This reinforces self-reliance in a grounded way. Self-reliance, however, does not mean isolation. Sailors rely on each other deeply near the Cape. The shared burden strengthens bonds. The sailor's mind associates safety with coordination rather than heroism. This association persists. Sailors who have learned this lesson are more likely to communicate clearly, to ask for input, to involve others in decisions. The Cape discourages solitary confidence. It favours collective awareness. Over time, the Cape becomes less a place and more a principle. It represents environments where complexity outpaces certainty, where progress is possible, but only with attention and restraint, where success is measured not by speed, but by outcome. This principle applies beyond sailing. Many sailors find themselves referencing the Cape mentally when facing prolonged challenges elsewhere. They recognise similar patterns, competing forces, slow erosion, the need for patience. The sailor's mind also retains a quiet gratitude associated with passing the Cape safely. Not celebration, but acknowledgement, a sense that things could have gone differently. This gratitude reinforces respect for circumstance and timing. It also deepens appreciation for calmer waters. After the Cape, even moderate seas feel generous. Rest feels earned. Simplicity feels valuable. These contrasts sharpen perception. The Cape's imprint does not fade quickly. Years later, sailors may still adjust posture unconsciously when waves cross at odd angles. They may still feel a flicker of alertness when wind shifts unexpectedly. These responses are learned, not forgotten. Importantly, this mental imprint does not make sailors anxious. It makes them measured. The Cape does not haunt. It educates. Its lessons are quiet, practical, and persistent. As sailors age and gain experience, the Cape often becomes a story told less frequently, but felt more deeply. Early voyages focus on survival. Later reflection focuses on understanding. The place evolves in memory from threat to teacher. This evolution is part of professional maturity. Sailors stop viewing difficult places as adversaries and start viewing them as environments with rules that must be learned. The Cape is one of the most effective instructors in this regard. In conversations with sailors who have passed it many times, a pattern emerges. They rarely speak of fear first. They speak of focus, of preparation, of respect. Fear is acknowledged, but it is not central. This reframing matters. It shifts the narrative from terror to responsibility. The Cape is not terrifying because it seeks harm. It is terrifying because it exposes weakness and punishes inattention. The sailor's mind absorbs this truth gradually. It becomes part of how risk is evaluated everywhere else. The Cape becomes a lens rather than a memory. As ships continue to pass this point year after year, new sailors join this lineage of experience. They bring fresh perspectives, modern tools, and different expectations. Yet the Cape meets them all the same way, and each time it leaves something behind. A subtle adjustment, a recalibration of judgment, a quiet respect that does not fade with distance. This is why the Cape remains powerful even when unseen. It exists not just in geography but in cognition. It lives in the way sailors think, plan and respond long after the coastline has disappeared. As we move forward, this internalization begins to intersect with something broader. What the Cape teaches does not end with the individual sailor. It shapes collective knowledge, shared practices, and the quiet wisdom passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that even as technology advances, the essential lessons of this place continue to be remembered. The sea does not explain itself. It does not pause to clarify intentions, and it does not offer summaries after difficult passages. What it teaches is learned indirectly, absorbed through repetition, discomfort, and survival rather than instruction. Near the Cape of Good Hope, these lessons arrive slowly, layered across days and nights, and they stay long after the ship has moved on. One of the first lessons sailors carry away from this place is that strength is not the same as dominance. Ships that fare well here are not those that attempt to overpower conditions, but those that adapt to them. Engines push only so far. Steel resists only so much. Beyond that, success depends on alignment rather than force. This understanding runs counter to many instincts, especially in a world accustomed to solving problems by applying more power. The sea teaches patience in a way few environments can. Not passive waiting, but active patience, the kind that involves constant monitoring, small adjustments, and restraint. Near the Cape, sailors learn that progress is not always visible. Hours of effort may result in little measurable movement, yet abandoning that effort invites far greater loss. Patience becomes a discipline rather than a personality trait. Another lesson lies in attention. The Cape demands sustained awareness rather than bursts of focus. Sailors learn that vigilance cannot be switched on only when conditions appear dramatic. The most dangerous moments often arise when conditions feel marginal rather than extreme. The sea teaches that consistency matters more than intensity. This lesson reshapes how sailors interpret calm. Calm is not taken as permission to relax completely, but as a temporary state to be appreciated and used wisely. Maintenance is done when conditions allow. Rest is prioritized. Decisions are revisited. Calm becomes preparation rather than reward. The sea also teaches humility, but not humiliation. It does not diminish skill or experience. Instead, it places them in context. Near the Cape, even the most capable sailors recognize that their competence operates within boundaries set by physics and chance. This recognition does not weaken confidence, it steadies it. Humility here means accepting that some outcomes are influenced by timing rather than merit. Two ships, equally well handled, may encounter very different conditions. One passes with difficulty, another with relative ease. The difference is not always skill. The sea teaches acceptance of this reality without surrendering responsibility. Another lesson concerns memory. The ocean remembers in ways humans do not immediately perceive. Energy travels. Currents carry the influence of distant storms. Conditions today are shaped by events that happened far away and days earlier. Near the Cape, sailors learn to think beyond the present moment, to consider not just what is happening, but what has happened before. This expanded sense of time influences planning. Decisions are made with an awareness of momentum rather than snapshots. Sailors learn to anticipate change rather than react to it. This skill becomes invaluable elsewhere, where cause and effect are less obvious. The sea also teaches restraint in judgment. Early in their careers, sailors often look for clear explanations. Storms are blamed. Equipment failures are isolated. Near the Cape, explanations blur. Multiple factors interact. Blame becomes less useful than understanding. This shift encourages reflection rather than accusation. After difficult passages, crews debrief not to assign fault, but to identify patterns. The sea teaches that learning requires honesty rather than defensiveness. Another lesson emerges around cooperation. No individual manages a ship alone, especially in demanding conditions. Near the Cape, teamwork is not optional. Communication must be clear. Trust must be mutual. Hierarchy exists, but it functions best when supported by shared awareness rather than rigid authority. The sea teaches that leadership here is not about command volume or decisiveness alone. It is about pacing, listening, and choosing when not to act. Sometimes the most effective decision is delay. Sometimes it is adjustment rather than commitment. Fatigue plays a central role in these lessons. The sea teaches respect for human limits. Near the Cape, ignoring fatigue leads to error. Acknowledging it leads to adaptation. Watches are adjusted. Tasks are prioritized. The body is treated as a critical system rather than an afterthought. This lesson carries forward into other environments. Sailors become more attentive to signs of strain in themselves and others. They intervene earlier, they rest when possible. The sea teaches that endurance is not infinite and pretending otherwise is costly. Another lesson is acceptance of ambiguity. The Cape resists clean narratives. Conditions change without clear cause. Outcomes vary despite similar inputs. The sea teaches comfort with incomplete information. Decisions must be made anyway. This acceptance does not mean complacency. It means flexibility. Plans are held lightly. Alternatives remain ready. Sailors learn to adapt without frustration, recognizing that frustration itself drains energy needed elsewhere. The sea also teaches respect for scale. Near the Cape, the size of the system becomes undeniable. The ocean is vast. The atmosphere is powerful. Human presence feels temporary and conditional. This perspective recalibrates priorities. Many sailors report that after passing the Cape, smaller problems elsewhere feel less urgent, not unimportant, but manageable. The sea teaches proportion. There is also a lesson in continuity. The Cape has behaved this way for centuries. Ships have changed, tools have improved, but the underlying forces remain. The sea teaches that progress does not erase natural systems. It intersects with them. This continuity fosters respect for tradition. Not tradition as nostalgia, but as accumulated knowledge. Sailors learn to value practices that have endured because they work. The sea rewards methods refined through experience. Another lesson is quiet confidence. Surviving the Cape does not produce bravado. It produces steadiness. Sailors emerge less inclined to prove themselves and more inclined to proceed carefully. Confidence becomes internal rather than performative. The sea also teaches gratitude, though not in obvious ways. After prolonged difficulty, simple conditions feel generous. Rest feels earned. Predictability feels valuable. Sailors learn to appreciate stability not as entitlement, but as opportunity. This appreciation influences behaviour. Maintenance is taken seriously. Complacency is avoided. The sea teaches that favourable conditions are not permanent, and preparation during calm determines outcomes during difficulty. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that passage is not conquest. Sailors do not defeat the Cape, they move through it. This distinction matters. It shapes how success is framed. Moving through rather than overcoming emphasises coexistence. The sea teaches that survival is a relationship rather than a victory. Respect replaces domination. Awareness replaces force. This lesson extends beyond maritime life. Sailors often carry it into other challenges, approaching them with patience, adaptability, and humility. The Cape becomes a reference for how to engage with complexity. The sea also teaches silence. Not every experience needs to be narrated. Not every difficulty requires retelling. Some lessons are absorbed privately. Near the Cape, sailors learn to be comfortable with that. This silence contributes to the mystique outsiders perceive. The fear associated with the Cape is not shouted. It is implied. It lives in pauses and careful language. As ships continue onward, these lessons do not announce themselves as complete. They integrate gradually. Sailors may not realise what they have learned until much later, when they find themselves responding differently in another context. The sea does not certify learning. It does not confirm mastery. It simply moves on, leaving humans to reflect on what has changed within them. Near the Cape of Good Hope, these lessons are particularly concentrated. The environment compresses experience, accelerates learning, and demands attention. Those who pass through emerge altered, not dramatically, but measurably. And as the sea continues its long circulation, carrying memory forward in currents and waves, it waits for the next passage, the next crew, the next opportunity to teach the same lessons again in slightly different ways, reminding each generation that some knowledge cannot be taught directly, only lived through, and that the true legacy of places like this lies not in the dangers they present, but in the understanding they leave behind. Long after a ship has cleared the southern edge of Africa, and the charts no longer show that familiar bend in the coastline, the Cape of Good Hope remains present in a quieter way. It does not follow as fear. It does not linger as tension. It simply exists as a reference, steady and unchanging, like a set of eyes turned back toward the sea, still watching the waves go by. The ocean there does not celebrate passage or mourn loss. It continues its movement with the same patience it has always had. Swells arrive from far away. Currents slide past one another without comment. Wind systems trace their paths across the water, indifferent to whether ships are present to notice. The Cape does not mark endings or beginnings in the way humans do. It marks continuity. For sailors who have passed through, this continuity becomes more apparent with time. The intensity of the experience fades, but the understanding remains. The Cape becomes less about danger remembered and more about perspective gained. It stands as proof that some places do not change simply because humans have learned to describe them better. Even today, standing on the cliffs or imagining them from the deck of a ship already moving north or east, it is easy to picture the scene repeating itself endlessly. Waves rise and fall. The meeting of oceans continues. Winds arrive, pass, and return. Nothing about the Cape suggests completion. It offers no sense of closure, it simply persists. This persistence is part of why the Cape continues to unsettle and instruct at the same time. Sailors may clear it successfully and feel relief, but they do not feel finality. The passage does not resolve into triumph. It dissolves gradually into routine, leaving behind a quiet awareness that the sea has not been conquered, only navigated temporarily. The Cape watching the waves go by is not an image of judgment or menace. It is an image of patience. The sea has all the time it needs. Ships arrive and depart, technology advances, routes shift. But the underlying movement remains the same. This realization tempers human urgency. Many sailors describe a subtle change in how they view progress after passing the Cape. Speed becomes less impressive. Efficiency feels secondary to judgment. Getting somewhere matters less than how you move through what lies in between. The Cape teaches this without instruction, simply by being what it is. On land, the Cape appears dramatic, photographed often for its cliffs and crashing surf. From the sea, its drama feels different. It is not theatrical, it is structural. The danger does not spike for effect. It accumulates, it lingers, it teaches through duration rather than spectacle. As ships move away and conditions stabilize, the body slowly lets go of the tension it has been holding. Muscles relax, sleep deepens, conversation returns, but the mind does not reset completely. It remains tuned to subtle changes, more alert to patterns that once passed unnoticed. This tuning does not fade quickly. Sailors find themselves applying it elsewhere. In calmer seas, they notice small shifts earlier. In difficult situations on land, they recognize the value of patience and incremental adjustment. The Cape's lessons translate quietly. Still watching the waves go by also means accepting that not every passage is remembered equally. Some ships pass the Cape in relative calm. Others struggle. Both experiences are valid. The Cape does not guarantee hardship. It guarantees possibility. This possibility keeps respect alive. Sailors do not assume the Cape will be dangerous every time. They assume it could be. That assumption shapes behavior more reliably than certainty ever could. There is also an understanding that the Cape does not belong to any single narrative. It is not solely a place of shipwrecks or storms. It is also a place of routine crossings, of uneventful passages, of crews who felt little more than discomfort. These stories are told less often because they lack drama, but they matter just as much. They remind sailors that danger is not inevitable, only potential. That preparation and timing matter. That experience accumulates unevenly. The Cape watches all of it without preference. Over centuries, this accumulation of passage after passage has created something like a collective gaze. Not a consciousness, but a presence in human thought. The Cape exists not only in geography, but in memory shared across generations. Each sailor adds to it, even if only by passing through without incident. The waves that move past the Cape today are not the same waves that moved past it centuries ago, but they are shaped by the same forces. Wind still transfers energy into water, currents still redistribute that energy across oceans, gravity still pulls everything back toward equilibrium. The Cape remains where these processes intersect visibly. For sailors, recognizing this continuity offers a strange comfort. It suggests that difficulty is not personal. The sea is not responding to individual effort or failure. It is operating according to rules that apply equally to all. This understanding reduces resentment and replaces it with acceptance. The Cape is not unfair. It is consistent in its inconsistency. That distinction matters. As ships continue onward, the Cape becomes part of the background of experience rather than the foreground. It no longer dominates attention, but it informs it. The sailor does not look back constantly. There is no need. The lesson has already been absorbed. This absorption does not diminish respect. If anything, it deepens it. Familiarity here does not breed contempt. It breeds caution. The Cape watching the waves go by is also an image of restraint. It does not reach out to stop ships or to challenge them. It simply exists. Those who choose to pass must do so on its terms, not because it enforces them actively, but because reality leaves no alternative. In a world that often celebrates control and mastery, this restraint feels instructive. It reminds sailors that coexistence is sometimes the most effective strategy, that adapting to conditions yields better outcomes than forcing outcomes. This perspective carries forward into how sailors speak about the Cape years later. Their language is measured. They do not exaggerate. They do not minimize. They speak as one might speak about something that deserves attention but not fear. Still watching the waves go by also means that the Cape does not collect trophies. It does not mark victories. It does not keep score. Ships that pass safely are not rewarded. Ships that are lost are not punished. The sea simply continues. This neutrality is difficult for humans to accept fully. We look for meaning in outcomes. We want success to feel deserved and loss to feel explainable. The Cape resists this impulse gently but firmly. In doing so, it teaches something that extends beyond navigation. It teaches acceptance of outcome without surrender of responsibility. Sailors still plan, still prepare, still decide. They simply accept that results are shaped by factors beyond intention. This acceptance is not passive. It is active humility. It sharpens judgment rather than dulling it. As the Cape continues to watch the waves go by, new generations of sailors approach with new tools and old instincts. They bring data, forecasts, experience and caution. The Cape meets them all the same way without adjustment. And as each ship passes, successfully or not, the Cape remains unchanged. The waves keep moving. The wind keeps circulating. The currents keep carrying memory forward. This constancy is perhaps the most unsettling and the most reassuring aspect of the Cape. It does not respond to human presence, but it accommodates it temporarily. Passage is allowed, not granted. For those who listen to the sea long enough, this becomes clear. The Cape does not terrify because it is violent. It terrifies because it is indifferent, and indifference strips away illusion. Still watching the waves go by means that the Cape will continue to teach the same lessons long after current stories fade, long after modern ships are replaced by something else, long after navigation changes again. The sea does not adapt to humans. Humans adapt to the sea, or they do not. The Cape stands as one of the clearest reminders of that truth. And as ships move onward into calmer waters, the sound of waves against hull softening, the horizon widening once more, The cape remains behind, doing nothing at all, which is precisely why it remains so powerful. Because it does not chase, threaten, or demand. It simply waits, patient and unchanged, watching the waves go by, knowing that sooner or later another ship will arrive, another crew will adjust their focus, and the same quiet exchange between human intention and natural force will begin again, exactly as it always has.